Tonight, we return to the grave that should have stayed simple. A boy, a curse, a body in the grass. The script everyone remembers. But in this version of the story, the grave in Little Hangleton does not behave. The flash of green has already faded. Cedric Diggory has already fallen. The echo of Voldemort's high, cold command still hangs in the mist as the robed figures close in, as Harry is dragged to the headstone that bears his parents' name. The grave was empty of comfort, empty of witnesses. That was the plan. Yet, as the cauldron boils and bone and flesh and blood are given to the Dark Lord's rebirth, something begins to go wrong with the script Voldemort has written for this night. Cedric should be still. He is not. A finger twitches against the damp earth, then a hand, then a shudder that looks almost like refusal. Magic clings to this graveyard like fog, old curses and older protections woven through the soil, and a killing curse, perfect in its cruelty, meets something it does not entirely understand. Cedric's heart does not return, his life does not flow back. But awareness flickers. Pain anchors it. He rises only a little, a maimed and fading replica of the boy who touched the Triwizard Cup, eyes clouded yet horribly clear as he watches a body knit itself in the cauldron's steam. This is important, because in canon, Harry is alone. Not Dumbledore, who had believed him, not Hagrid, who had trusted him, not Sirius, who had loved him, can stand in that graveyard and see what he sees, the Dark Lord pale and whole again, calling his servants from the shadows. In the original story, when Harry returns, he carries a truth that feels like a nightmare no one wishes to share. Here, he is not the only one who knew. Cedric hears the name, feels the mark burn on the arms around him, watches the circle close and understands, in the slow, terrible clarity of the dying, that Harry will be asked to bear this alone if he cannot speak. Hufflepuff's golden boy, the fair champion, becomes something Voldemort never planned for, an unwilling, irrefutable second witness. But this is not a power fantasy where one more voice fixes everything. It is a darker, more ordered tragedy. Earlier truth does not erase fear, it only rearranges who breaks and when. The ministry will still tremble. Parents will still look for reasons to deny what stands before them. The grave was empty of easy answers, and when the wands lock, when the Priori Incantatem sings and the dead gather in pale light, Cedric's shade is not the only Cedric present. The breathing boy drags himself closer, forcing air into ruined lungs, determined to stand where history can see him. When Harry grasps the cup, when the portkey yanks them from the grave, Cedric's hand is on his arm. This time, Cedric Diggory is still breathing as they vanish in blue light. What does a frightened world do when denial becomes harder and the truth comes home in duplicate? The graveyard did not spare him. The curse still struck. The magic still howled. The divergence lies in what the graveyard does with that howl. The killing curse leaves Voldemort's wand as in canon, a perfect arc of emerald annihilation. But it does not meet an ordinary human body. It meets a boy standing at the precise intersection of too many enchantments. The Triwizard Cup's portkey pull already coiled around him. The resurrection cauldron's blood-soaked vapor thick in his lungs. Ancient grave magic humming beneath his feet like a buried storm. This is important. In that instant, the spells tangle. The cup's enchantment strains, trying to complete its circuit and return both champions to Hogwarts. The grave's own protections, older than the Ministry itself, refuse to release a freshly killed soul. The curse lands, but its perfect, instantaneous severing of life is twisted into something uglier, slower, a catastrophic wound that shreds nerves and blood and bone without quite extinguishing the light behind Cedric Diggory's eyes. He dies. But he does not die yet. When they slam back onto Hogwarts grounds, the difference is visible before anyone can deny it. Harry sprawls across the grass, gasping, clutching the cup. Beside him, Cedric does not lie in the still, waxen quiet of a corpse. He convulses. He coughs blood onto the pitch, onto the trim of his Hufflepuff robes, onto the shoes of the students who surge forward and then freeze in a ring of horrified silence. His chest is caved on one side, ribs like shattered wands. His breathing is a wet, rattling struggle, but it is breathing. He is alive enough to scream. Not Dumbledore, who had already begun, in some distant corner of his mind, to prepare for the familiar pattern of disbelief. Not Hagrid, who had carried broken bodies before and thought he knew the weight of a boy who would never speak again. None of them are ready when Cedric's hand claws at Dumbledore's sleeve and he forces out words that everyone can hear. Voldemort, back, grave, killed, me. This is important. Because Cedric Diggory is not Harry Potter. Cedric is the Hufflepuff prefect who walked first years to class when they were lost, who refused a rematch when Slytherin fouled him in the air, who waited for Harry in the maze instead of racing alone for glory. His teachers know him as level-headed, almost old-fashioned in his sense of fairness. His peers know him as the boy who never embellished a story to make himself look grand. Harry is the boy who lived, the lightning rod for prophecy and gossip, the center of a narrative that has always been half myth. Cedric is the boy who never asked to be a symbol. His word lands differently. In this altered night, the Ministry is not confronted with a single traumatized champion insisting on an impossible resurrection. It is confronted with Convergence, Harry's raw, stumbling account, and Cedric's blood-choked confirmation, delivered while he is visibly paying the price of that graveyard with his life. Fudge cannot look away from the torn chest, from the way Madame Pomfrey's charms slide off curse-burned flesh that will not knit. A line has been crossed. Denial becomes an act of will, not an easy reflex. From here, the story will not rush. We will move chronologically, step by step, through the echo of that altered breath. How it fractures Hogwarts politics, how it forces the Ministry into new, desperate plans, how it drives Voldemort to change his war. The grave was empty of comfort now. There is no clean ignorance to retreat into. The truth has come home in duplicate, and every choice that follows will be made in its shadow. The cup hit grass. Harry hit his knees. Cedric hit the world between. They did not land in triumph. They fell out of the portkey like broken replicas of champions tangled in torn robes and grave dirt, the maze looming behind them like a living wall. For a moment there was only the stunned hush of a crowd that did not yet understand what it was seeing. Then someone screamed. Then several someones. Then the sound became a single rising note of panic. Dumbledore was moving before anyone else. Not Dumbledore, who had stood still in Godric's Hollow and watched two small coffins sink into a grave that he believed was full. This Dumbledore pushed through students and officials with a terrible, focused calm, his wand already out, his eyes already searching for the wound he knew must be there. Cedric was trying to breathe. That was the first horrifying fact. His chest hitched shallowly, clothes darkening where the curse had burned through, lips flecked with blood as though the graveyard itself had marked him. This is important. He should have been a body. He was not. He was still impossibly alive. Harry's hands were on him, shaking, smearing mud and blood together. Words tumbled out in a hoarse rush. The grave, the statue, the rope of light that had connected his wand to another, the circle of masked faces. He spoke of a cauldron and bone and blood and a high, cold voice. He spoke the name. Voldemort, Cedric's fingers twitched at that, as if the name were a summons. He turned his head with visible effort, grey eyes finding Dumbledore's face, then Harry's. When he spoke, the words came in fragments, each one dragged up through pain. "Graveyard," he rasped. "Little Muggle grave. A cough, wet and red. Ritual, bone, blood, flesh, Death Eaters all around. Masks, dark mark above us." The crowd heard him. Dozens of witnesses, packed so close their robes brushed, every breath shared. Professors, aurors, foreign judges. Children. The story that in another timeline would be dismissed as one boy's hysteria was now being carved into the air by a dying Hufflepuff who had never lied for glory. Amos Diggory forced his way forward last, not Hagrid, who had once carried another boy from another ruin, not Sirius, who had watched from shadows and prison cells. Amos arrived as a father, not a soldier, and for one heartbeat his world contained only the ruin of his son's body. His howl was raw, animal, the sound of a man whose plan for his life had just been torn in half. Then Cedric said the name. "Voldemort," he whispered, and the pitch of Amos's grief changed. Horror became direction. Grief became a weapon that could be aimed. His head snapped toward the ministry officials, toward Cornelius Fudge himself, and in his eyes there was suddenly someone to blame beyond hedges and monsters and chance. Fudge had been hanging back, flanked by aides and aurors, wrapped in the comfortable charm of denial. Now he stepped closer, color draining, as if the magic had been stripped from his blood. Cedric Diggory was a ministry favorite. The safe golden boy Fudge had praised in speeches, the story he liked to tell about unity and international cooperation. How do you dismiss the truth when it is leaking from that boy's lungs? "I saw him," Cedric forced out, gaze catching Fudge's for a shuddering instant. Tall, white snake face, wand in his hand. He called them Death Eaters. They answered. Another breath, a broken hitch. "He's back. Voldemort's back." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of shattered certainties. The grave was empty of comfort, and so was the future. Cedric turned his head one last time, searching for Harry, finding him through tears and smoke. His hand lifted, shaking, and Harry caught it, fingers closing around fingers. "He's back, believe him," Cedric said, simple as a verdict. His hand tightened once and then went slack. The air itself seemed to recoil. No one moved. No one spoke. In that stunned, echoing stillness, as Fudge's face flickered between fear and calculation, the next war began to choose its shape. The world in the stands held its breath. Down in Harry's arms, Cedric's breath had already been measured, counted, nearly spent. But the story of that night did not begin on the grass. It began in the grave. The grave was real. The grave was cold. The grave was ringed with stone and bone and chanting. Cedric lay crumpled near the headstone of Tom Riddle, his mind a fractured mirror, catching only shards of what unfolded when the portkey ripped them out of the light and into that place. He did not die at once. This is important. Consciousness came and went in pulses, like waves breaking against rock. In one pulse, he felt the rough grit of soil against his cheek, smelt metal and ash, heard Harry shouting his name. In the next, there was only the high, cruel voice giving orders, and the wet sound of something small and pitiful being dropped into a cauldron. He heard ropes rasp across stone as Harry was bound to the grave, the scrape of wood against the headstone as the boy's back struck it. He could not open his eyes, but he could feel the magic thicken, could taste it, old and grave and wrong, gathering around the cauldron like a storm. A hiss slid through the air, not quite words, not quite animal. The sound of parcel tongue curling over syllables his mind could not shape. Names began. That he remembered. One by one, called into the dark. Malfoy, Nott, Crabbe, voices answered, some steady, some trembling, boots scuffing, as cloaked figures stepped forward and knelt. Cedric knew those names, knew their children, knew their reputations at Hogwarts, the weight they carried in ministry corridors. Fairness was bone deep in him. Loyalty was not a banner, but a reflex. And as he lay beside the grave, he understood with a slow, spreading horror that men praised in the Daily Prophet were bending the knee to the resurrected murderer of his classmates' parents. Not Dumbledore, who had stood in the Great Hall and spoken of unity. Not Hagrid, who had told stories of auras and heroes by firelight. Not Sirius, who had rotted in Azkaban for a crime this circle had helped conceal. It was the respectable ones, the safe ones, the ones adults trusted. Voldemort spoke of plans, of infiltration already achieved, of the Ministry's fear. Cedric heard the intent like a blade sliding free. Send the boy back. Send the replica of a tournament victory, the corpse of a Hogwarts champion, and let confusion do what curses could not. Harry would return alive but alone, carrying a truth that power would find convenient to deny. In one lucid, searing instant, Cedric saw it. Fudge's doubt, skepticism in staff rooms, Hufflepuffs torn between grief and disbelief, his own body used as evidence against the truth. So he chose. He gathered what remained of himself and fixed it to a single, stubborn decision. When the portkey dragged them from the graveyard, he would not spend his last breath on comfort. He would spend it on testimony. That was why, on the grass, his hand found Harry's. That was why his words were not farewell but verdict. And somewhere, beneath the panic and the screams and the minister's rising denial, the shape of the next move in this hidden war began to change. Because Cedric Diggory had heard the names. He had felt the ropes. He had listened at the edge of the grave, and he had decided that his death would not be allowed to lie. Dumbledore heard Cedric's last words as clearly as if they had been spoken into his own wand hand. Voldemort, Death Eaters. The grave. The ropes. This is important, not because he doubted the boy, but because he had never expected, in this lifetime, to be handed public corroboration on a silver plate soaked in blood. His expression did not change in the way the students expected. There was no widening of the eyes at the name that had haunted his generation, no visible shock at the story Harry and Cedric were forcing into the open. Dumbledore had known. Long before the graveyard, long before the tournament, he had felt the old magic stirring. The pattern reforming around a familiar absence that was not absence at all. The grave was empty. That had always been the secret shape of his fear. What altered in the space between Cedric's laboured breaths and his stillness was not knowledge, but leverage. In canon, he had been forced into quiet, into letters written in coded ink, into meetings in kitchens, into a war reborn in whispers, because the minister preferred a comforting lie to a destabilizing truth. Here the axis tilted. Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff's exemplar, had given him what no prophecy and no scar could provide, a dying oath in public, witnessed by judges, teachers, aurors, students. The story was no longer Harry's alone. It was a chorus, however brief. His mind moved faster than his face. Short, precise, relentless, Snape first. A glance, no more than the flick of an old commander recalling an embedded spy, and Severus was already stepping back into shadow, understanding that the old plan had accelerated. Return to your master. Confirm, deceive, survive, then McGonagall, summoned by a quiet word that cut through the rising panic. She was to herd the students, seal the entrances, turn the castle into a fortress draped in the illusion of normality. And beyond them, in the edges of the crowd, he caught the eyes of two trusted aurors, men and women who remembered the First War and had never quite stopped living as if it were still alive. This is important, because delay had always been Voldemort's greatest weapon. In the original timeline, denial bought the Dark Lord 2 priceless years, time to recruit, to infiltrate, to turn the Ministry's own fear into a shield. Now Cedric's words had shattered that shield in front of everyone. Proof would not prevent the war. It would hasten it. Dumbledore felt the weight of that paradox settle on his shoulders like an old familiar cloak. He thought fleetingly of other secrets, of other graves that were not graves, of protections woven from love and lie, of a boy who had grown up believing himself alone because Lily was a charms prodigy, and because some plans required unbearable silence. How many buried truths could the world survive at once? Then he turned to Cornelius Fudge. His voice, when it came, was low and implacable, stripped of its usual whimsy. He invited the minister to walk with him, away from the students, away from the judges, away from the trembling replica of celebration that still clung to the stands. Come, Cornelius, there are things we must now face. And with that, the war stepped out of the shadows and began to speak in daylight. They walked in silence to the hospital wing. The celebration followed at a distance, a thin, bewildered murmur that did not yet understand that its own grave had just been dug. This is important. The air in the corridor felt wrong, as if the magic in the stones were bracing for impact. Cornelius Fudge had always feared two things more than Voldemort's name: losing control and being remembered as the minister who let the world fall apart. He feared panic in the streets, the collapse of Gringotts, the headlines that would turn his name into a cautionary tale told to children. He feared his portrait hanging crooked and ignored. The man who presided over the Second War and failed. In canon, he would cling to denial like a charm against the dark. Here, denial had a body. Cedric Diggory lay on the nearest bed, still in his torn school robes, the Triwizard crest a cruel, bright replica of celebration over a chest that no longer rose. A white sheet hovered nearby, waiting. Madame Pomfrey's hands shook. Harry, pale and half-conscious, lay only a few feet away, whispering fragments of the graveyard, the circle of Death Eaters, the high, cold voice that had been dead and was now alive. Amos Diggory arrived like a storm. He did not enter, he crashed. His voice, when he saw his son, was not a cry so much as a rending. The walls seemed to pull back from it. He demanded answers, demanded action, demanded the Minister of Magic explain how a school tournament had become a battlefield. Each question was a blow. Each syllable shook the room. Fudge watched the sheet being drawn over Cedric's face and felt the fragile architecture of his plan begin to crack. Discrediting Harry was one thing. A troubled boy, a history of danger, whispers of attention seeking. That story could be spun. But Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff's exemplar, the Ministry's own golden champion, the poster child of the Triwizard revival? To call him unreliable now would mean striking at a grieving father, at Hogwarts itself, at the narrative the Ministry had so carefully built. His mind raced. Could he say the boy had been confounded? That Harry, unstable, had dragged Cedric into some delusion? Already, advisors at his shoulder began to murmur. Perhaps the graveyard magic had distorted their memories. Perhaps Dumbledore had orchestrated something. Perhaps this was a tragedy without a Dark Lord. Not Dumbledore, who had stood beside him for years, they suggested now, but Dumbledore, who had his own designs, his own secret war. This is important. If he named Voldemort, the economy would shudder, parents would pull children from Hogwarts, the Wizengamot would demand emergency powers he might not control. If he refused, Cedric's death would become a question that would not stay buried. Fudge stared at the still outline beneath the sheet. The grave was empty, but the cost was not. Whatever story he chose, that face would be there, unseen yet present, at every press conference, every Wizengamot session, every restless night. Would it remain silent, or would someone, somewhere, find a way to let Cedric Diggory speak again? Cedric Diggory did speak again. Not in a courtroom, not in a ministry press conference, but in the hushed, echoing vastness of the Great Hall, where 4 house tables waited beneath a ceiling of restless stars, and the taste of fear lay sharp as iron on the tongue. Dumbledore stood at the lectern, older than he had seemed that morning. The candles burned lower. The shadows felt longer. This is important. In canon, he merely told them Cedric was dead. In this story, he tells them how Cedric died, and what he said with the last of his breath. Cedric Diggory, he says, and the name moves through the hall like a charm, drawing every gaze, every heartbeat. A Hufflepuff, a champion, and a brave young man was murdered tonight. He was murdered on the orders of Lord Voldemort, who has returned to a body of flesh and blood. Cedric died confirming this truth. The word lands. Voldemort. The grave was empty of euphemism now. There is no talk of accidents or mischance. A boy they loved died naming the darkness that killed him. That cannot be quietly filed away. At the Hufflepuff table, the reaction is not uniform. Grief never is. Some are weeping openly, shoulders shaking, faces buried in sleeves. Others are dry-eyed and furious, hands clenched on the wood, knuckles white, as if the table itself might answer for the injustice. A few stare straight ahead, stunned, as if the magic of the castle has betrayed them by letting this be real. Gryffindor listens in a different silence. They look at Harry, then at Cedric's empty place across the hall, and something grim settles over them. Vindication is a bitter draught. Harry had been right, and the cost of being right is written in Hufflepuff, yellow and black, in the gap where a champion should be. It does not feel like triumph. It feels like a warning. Ravenclaw minds are already moving. If Cedric corroborated Harry's story, What does that mean for their parents in the ministry, for the Daily Prophet, for every comforting lie about peace since 1981? They are calculating timelines, remembering whispered names, drawing invisible diagrams in the air between the tables. The implications are a map only they can see. And Slytherin. Slytherin is very, very quiet. Some faces are carefully blank, masks learned at pure blood dinner tables, others are pale, eyes fixed on Dumbledore, on Harry, on the doors, as if expecting auras to march in and start pointing wands. A few look down, remembering stories told in low voices about masked figures around a grave and a boy who would not die. Harry sits beneath the weight of every stare. The isolation has shifted in flavor. He is still alone with the graveyard in his head, with green light and cold laughter, but he is no longer the lone herald of doom. Cedric's name is spoken in the same breath as his now, for honor and for horror. Wherever he walks, the story follows, Harry and Cedric. The boy who lived and the boy who proved it. In the staff room later, the adults are not composed. McGonagall's teacup rattles against its saucer as she listens to Dumbledore repeat the essential details. She remembers other masks, other nights, the first war when students' parents vanished from the stands and reappeared in the Prophet under black borders. Not Dumbledore, who had always carried more names than he ever spoke aloud. Not Hagrid, who had ferried too many orphans from ruined homes. Not Sirius, who had watched his own family choose the graveyard circle. None of them are surprised. They are only devastated that the story has begun again. Some of them, the older ones, are counting faces from the leaving feasts of years past, laying them like replicas over the unknown Death Eaters in the circle. Which father, which mother, which smiling witch who once clapped politely at Quidditch now stood and watched a boy die? When the students finally rise from their benches, the camera of our attention lingers. It does not follow Harry out. It drifts instead to the Hufflepuff table, to a specific place on the bench where the wood is a little more worn, where laughter used to live. There is a gap. It is small, no wider than a boy's shoulders, but it is a chasm. A visible absence, a living proof that Voldemort is not a story from someone else's war. He is alive. He has taken a child from their midst. And that empty space in yellow and black is a grave that cannot be denied, a wound in the castle itself that no ministry decree can quietly bury. The truth has a seat at the table now. It will not move. What can a government do against a ghost that sits down to every meal? It is not just Harry anymore. That is the fracture line. That is the point at which denial stops being an abstract policy and becomes a direct contradiction of a boy every parent thought they understood. Cedric Diggory in canon is not a symbol of rebellion or prophecy. He is the quiet centre of Hufflepuff made visible, fair on the Quidditch pitch when a rematch would have favoured him, kind to younger students who trail after him with wide eyes, diligent in class in a way that earns not only house points but the unspoken approval of professors. He is the student Sprout points to with pride, the one McGonagall respects without reservation. He is what happens when loyalty, patience, and work harden into integrity instead of ambition. This is important, because public perception in the wizarding world has already split around Harry like water around a rock. Harry is the boy who lived, the child in every bedtime story about the grave in Godric's Hollow. He is also the boy who sees snakes in walls, who faints near Dementors, who is rumoured to have faced a basilisk and returned alive when others did not. To some he is a miracle, to others he is a magnet for catastrophe. A prophecy made flesh and therefore inherently political. Cedric is none of these things. Cedric is safe. Apolitical, a golden boy whose greatest controversy is winning a tournament he tried to share. Parents can project their own children onto him without strain. They can imagine their own son shaking Harry's hand before the maze, their own daughter watching him from the stands. When that boy speaks, or when his last words are carried back from a graveyard by magic and memory, the story can no longer be dismissed as the dramatics of a damaged child. Let us go home. Hufflepuff quills scratch late into the night. They write of Cedric's face, pale and resolute, of his voice matching Harry's, "He is back. Voldemort is back." The Diggory name does not echo like Malfoy or Black, but in certain ministry offices, in certain social circles, it carries weight. Amos has colleagues. Amos has friends. Not Dumbledore, who had been easy to paint as alarmist. Ordinary clerks and aurors and Department of Magical Games and sports officials knew Cedric as the boy who visited his father at work, polite and earnest in the corridor. The Daily Prophet feels the trap close. Smearing Harry is simple, they have already laid that groundwork. Smearing Cedric means telling every mother reading over breakfast that her trust in Hogwarts, in the ministry, in the idea that hard work and goodness keep children safe, was misplaced. It means suggesting that the boy who died fairly, who played fairly, lied at the end. How many subscriptions survive that accusation? And so Cedric's very normalcy becomes a weapon. The grave was empty of ambiguity now. His testimony is a mirror held up to every family that wants to believe the war is over forever, reflecting a truth they do not wish to see. The question is no longer whether they believe Harry Potter. It is whether they can afford to call their own reflection a liar. The grave was empty of ambiguity, but grief does not care for clarity. It cares for weight, for the unbearable heaviness of a father's hand on a son's still chest. At St. Mungo's, in a private ward that smelled of dittany and ash, Amos Diggory anchored himself beside Cedric's body and refused to move. He would not let healers close the curtains. He would not let them cast softening charms on the light or the air. He wanted it bright, harsh, undeniable. Again and again he repeated Cedric's final. Fractured account to anyone who entered, the cup had been a portkey, the graveyard had been real, the dark mark had burned, and Voldemort had stood there, alive, wand raised. This is important. He said it to junior healers, changing bandages they did not need to change. He said it to a senior undersecretary who arrived with flowers and left with shaking hands. At first, it was the babble of a shattered man. A story poured out because if he stopped speaking, he would have to admit the silence on the bed. But something altered as the hours passed. The repetition hardened. The words aligned. Amos began to realize that Cedric's last testimony was not only the end of his child's life. It was the beginning of a task. If Cedric had died naming Voldemort, then Amos would live naming him louder. The transition was not gentle. It was a break, like bone under too much pressure. He straightened his back. He stopped weeping between sentences. He started taking names, dates, departments. Who had heard him? Who had flinched when he said Voldemort, and who had not? He knew the ministry. He knew how stories were buried long before they reached a grave. Amos Diggory was not a political titan, but he was not alone either. Years in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures meant long nights over coffee with colleagues who owed him favors, who trusted his judgment when a werewolf pack needed delicate handling or a dragon reserve needed a new treaty. Old school friends now wore aura robes and carried scars. A cousin, dry and sharp, sat on the Wizengamot and understood procedure like other people understood Quidditch scores. This is important. Voldemort's name was no longer carried only by children and Dumbledore. It moved through corridors of power on the breath of a grieving Hufflepuff father. The first confrontation came in an antechamber, not a courtroom. No formal benches, only conjured chairs and the faint, anxious rustle of parchment. Cornelius Fudge arrived expecting to soothe, to placate, to promise a tasteful memorial and a generous pension. He found instead a man who had rehearsed his questions the way others rehearsed duels. Amos did not bow. He did not rage incoherently. He laid out Cedric's words like evidence, each phrase a stone in a path that led inexorably to the graveyard. Who authorized the cup's protections? Who checked the portkey registry? Why had no aura escort been present when the champions touched an object that could be so easily tampered with? Not Dumbledore, who had already demanded action in his own way. Not Hagrid, who had stood guard over the maze. This weight was for the Ministry. Fudge tried denial, then minimization, then the old poisonous suggestion that Harry Potter's hysteria had infected another boy. Amos stepped forward, voice low and carrying. "My son died speaking the truth. If this Ministry will not speak it with him, I will drag it into every corridor you walk." There were witnesses, a scribe from magical law enforcement, a healer who had followed, just in case, an aura at the door, hand frozen on his wand. They heard the vow and felt the room tilt, as if the building itself were listening. Because once grief becomes a weapon, who can be certain where it will strike next? The vow did not stay in that office. It leaked, the way all dangerous things at the Ministry eventually leaked, seeping under doors and through keyholes until it reached the rooms where fear had learned to wear a uniform. That night, senior auras were summoned without public notice. No memos, no posted agenda, just quiet knocks, a Patronus message here, a word in a corridor there. They gathered in a windowless briefing chamber 3 floors below the atrium, men and women who still woke to the smell of burning from the First War. They listened as Shacklebolt laid out Cedric's testimony, as a shaken scribe read back the graveyard account. Wands on the table, hands clenched. No one spoke for a long time, because this is what they heard: a reborn body, a circle of masked figures, a killing curse that had missed its intended target only because Voldemort had been playing with his food. This is important. The details matched stories they had tried to forget. The phrasing of the threats, the use of the dark mark, the contempt for Ministry law as anything but an inconvenience. The split began there, in that hush. One camp argued with low, urgent voices that Fudge must be pressed to acknowledge the threat, to begin quiet mobilization, to recall retired auras and reopen cold files from the last war. They spoke of contingency plans, of ward expansions, of what it would mean if the grave in Little Hangleton was not in fact a grave any longer, but a doorway. The other camp answered with equal intensity that a public admission would shatter already fragile trust, send families fleeing, and hand Dumbledore a moral scepter he would never relinquish. Not Dumbledore, who had rebuilt Hogwarts after the last war and who already moved like a general inspecting a battlefield. Not Hagrid, who had carried children out of the ruins of homes and would do it again without hesitation. Not Sirius, who had rotted in Azkaban while these same corridors pretended the story was over. Their names hung unspoken, fault lines in human form. In the days that followed, figures stepped into place. Scrimgeour, lion-haired and tired, began to visit that briefing room more often, asking precise questions about wand traces and graveyard wards, already calculating how an open conflict might justify transferring more power to the Auror office. Amelia Bones, with her square jaw and uncompromising gaze, demanded records, eyewitness lists, the exact language of Cedric's last words. She did not say she believed, she behaved as if belief was irrelevant to duty. And then there was Umbridge. She moved through the ministry like a soft-voiced infection, murmuring that Cedric's death was a tragedy that must not be politicized, that Harry's haunted eyes were the result of pressure and manipulation, that Dumbledore's history of defiance proved he would use any grave, any corpse, as a stage. Rumour did the rest. Junior clerks whispered over teetering stacks of parchment about dark marks in the sky, about Cedric's body bearing traces of ancient magic no ordinary duel could explain, about Harry waking in the hospital wing, screaming in a voice that was not his own. One said he had seen the replica of the Triwizard Cup brought back from the grounds, its handle scorched with a curse that made ink curdle on contact. Another swore that portraits along the corridor had fallen silent when the boy passed, as if even painted ghosts knew something had come back alive. The grave was empty, someone said in a lift, and no one asked which grave he meant. Under this pressure, Fudge did what weak men with too much power often do. He tried to buy time. He authorized a limited internal investigation into the graveyard incident, discreet interviews, a review of Cedric's wand, a quiet request to the Department of Mysteries for purely academic insight into resurrection magic. No public declaration. No profit headline. An investigation that was meant to contain the story rather than confront the truth. But once an institution begins to investigate its own nightmares, how long can it pretend those nightmares are not already awake? The investigation followed Harry home. It did not arrive as headlines calling him delusional. It arrived as silence, as carefully worded statements, as a ministry that refused to say he was lying and refused just as stubbornly to say he was right. This is important. In canon, Harry begins his 5th year already condemned in print. Here, his story is not believed, but it is not dismissed. It is suspended above the country like a held breath. On Privet Drive, that breath turned the Dursleys' neat, petty world into something brittle. Vernon Dursley read the clipped article twice, his eyes snagging on phrases like graveyard incident and ongoing security review. He had always thought of Hogwarts as a bizarre boarding school, a regrettable mistake that could be contained by locks and a good shout. Now he saw the boy he resented tied, in black ink, to a national security crisis. Not a school accident. A war. Petunia heard the word graveyard on the evening news and could not stop thinking of another grave, another boy, another sister whose story had ended under a green sky. They watched Harry with a new, uneasy distance, as if he were a volatile charm that might go off without warning. Vernon's fear expressed itself as tighter rules, shorter tempers. The radio turned up when the word magic appeared between the traffic and the weather. Dudley stared at Harry's lightning scar with the horrified fascination of someone realizing that the monster in the story might be alive and living in the smallest bedroom. For Harry, the difference cut along a strange, invisible seam. He was not waking to see his own face twisted on the prophet's front page, labeled attention-seeking and unstable. There were no neighbors whispering about a boy who thought he who must not be named had returned. There was instead the knowledge that somewhere in the ministry, men and women in plum-colored robes were examining wands, interviewing witnesses, weighing Cedric Diggory's last words against the comfort of denial. Relief came in thin, guilty threads. He was not being called a liar. He was not, this time, alone in shouting the truth into a void. Yet every moment of that relief was poisoned by memory. Cedric's hand slipping from his, the echo of "Take my body back," the look on Amos and Mrs. Diggory's faces when they knew their son had died in a graveyard, meant for champions, not for children. The grave was empty of comfort. Survivor's guilt settled heavier because the world, at last, might listen. The letters reflected that shift. Ron's handwriting shook, not with outrage on Harry's behalf, but with fear for his own. He wrote about his father's hushed conversations, about Bill sending word from Gringotts that the goblins were watching ministry movements with cold, calculating interest. Hermione's letters were dense with analysis and dread. She cited old laws about emergency powers, asked whether Muggle-born families would be evacuated if the investigation confirmed what they all already knew. Their tone had changed. Less, "We believe you." More, "What happens to us when everyone does?" Not Dumbledore, who had once let Harry stand alone as a strategic shield against disbelief. Not Hagrid, who had always thundered his faith in Harry whether it helped or not. Here, even their silence felt different, shaped by a ministry that could not quite bury the story and could not quite face it. On a warm, airless night, Harry stood in the back garden and looked up at the sky over Privet Drive. It was the same sky that had watched over the graveyard. It was the same sky that arched above the ministry roofs where people argued about his life as if it were a hypothetical charm. The war was no longer a secret he carried alone. This was important. Knowledge had spread, thin and sharp as glass, across the wizarding world. That might make him safer, wrapped in the reluctant protection extended to a symbol under public scrutiny. It might also make him more expendable, a piece in a larger plan now that the nightmare was shared, and the boy at its center was no longer the only witness. Somewhere, decisions were being drafted in rooms he would never see. Somewhere, people were deciding how much of Harry Potter they could afford to lose. Somewhere, while Harry lay awake in the hospital wing, listening to the echo of Cedric's last words in his skull, another house was waking. It had been sleeping for years, steeped in dust and old black magic, its windows shuttered against a world that believed itself at peace. Grimmauld Place was about to remember what it was. The grave was empty. This is the thing that nobody knew as they walked past the darkened square in London, as Muggles hurried by without seeing the number that was not there. Not Dumbledore, who had once stood on that doorstep as a much younger man and watched a pure-blood matriarch slam the door in his face. Not Sirius, who had rotted in Azkaban while his ancestral home decayed, its walls absorbing every whispered curse. But Dumbledore knew something else now. He had no time left to wait for perfect proof. Grimmauld Place did not flicker back into use in the slow, reluctant way of the original story. It came alive months earlier, summoned by a headmaster who walked its corridors as if measuring out the remaining years of the war. The kitchen filled first, Shacklebolt and Tonks at the same table as McGonagall, Lupin and Molly Weasley, steam from the kettle fogging the air, while Dumbledore laid Cedric's testimony on the scrubbed wood like a legal document and a death sentence combined. This is important. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. A Hufflepuff's word, a boy with no history of trouble, no taste for drama, no reason to lie, had corroborated Harry's account in front of Aurors and Ministry staff. The luxury of waiting for Voldemort to walk into the atrium and demonstrate his own resurrection was gone. In private, Dumbledore moved from ally to ally like a slow, inexorable tide, telling them the same thing in different rooms. If they delayed until Fudge could no longer deny the truth, the graveyards would already be full. The plan shifted. In canon, the early order had been a network of eyes and ears, an invisible net of information gatherers trying to trace whispers of a shadow that most refused to see. Here, Dumbledore inverted the sequence. Instead of listening first, he fortified. Hogwarts wards were thickened and layered, ancient castle magic stirred with new charms that hummed under the stone like a second heartbeat. At the Ministry, quiet protections were woven into the Department of Mysteries and the Auror headquarters, subtle enough not to offend Fudge, strong enough to slow a strike. Beyond London, known Muggle-born communities were mapped and circled, safe houses rewarded before the first attack. Not everyone agreed. Molly worried that visible preparations would push the minister from anxious denial into open hostility, turning the political grave into which the order might fall into something very real. Shacklebolt warned that too much unsanctioned fortification could look like sedition. Moody only snarled that they were already behind, that Voldemort had enjoyed 13 years of planning while they debated optics over tea. In the end, Dumbledore walked to a bare wall in Grimmauld Place and raised his wand. A map of Britain unfurled, parchment pinning itself with a sound like nails in a coffin. One by one, he marked locations not just of strategic value, but of memory. A seaside orphanage, a gaunt shack, a cave where children had once been lured and terrified, places where Tom Riddle had tested his magic, his cruelty, his soul. Lily was a charms prodigy, and somewhere far from London, her own map was already inked with many of the same points. Dumbledore did not know that, but he felt the same urgency. The Horcrux hunt would not wait for Harry's 6th year. It would begin now, in quiet, in secret, in the spaces between fortifying the living and unearthing what should never have been allowed to remain alive. How many lives might that acceleration save, and whose death would it merely postpone? The Ministry could no longer pretend the graveyard was a misunderstanding. Cedric Diggory's testimony, brief and broken though it had been, had settled over the wizarding world like a shroud. This is important. Harry was no longer a lone, traumatized boy insisting on an unbearable truth. He was echoed by Hufflepuff's exemplar. By a son, Amos Diggory had watched stagger back from the edge of a grave and name Voldemort. In canon, Dolores Umbridge arrives as the smiling face of denial, a pink-clad replica of Ministry certainty sent to smother Dumbledore's lies and Harry's influence. Her quills, her decrees, her simpering speeches about discipline are all built on one foundational claim, that the Dark Lord is not alive. that the story ends in that cemetery with hysteria and confusion, not resurrection. But in this altered timeline, the grave was empty of that comforting fiction. Parents of Hufflepuffs and of Ravenclaws who trusted Cedric's judgment, and of Slytherins who understood how power really moved, no longer saw Hogwarts as a mere propaganda battleground. They saw a front line, a castle in which their children might be the next pulled to a graveyard and forced to watch impossible magic made flesh. Fudge felt that shift like a tightening noose. In a closed, tense meeting at the Ministry, the air thick with the rustle of parchment and the metallic scent of fear, he faced not only Dumbledore's implacable gaze, but Amos Diggory's grief-sharpened fury and the cold, professional skepticism of aurors who had seen too many dark marks to accept comforting lies. Not Dumbledore, who had already begun to move pieces for war. Not Sirius, who had lived with Azkaban's memory of Voldemort. It was the rank and file, the parents, the board, who now demanded something that looked like action. So Fudge did what frightened politicians do. He reframed. Umbridge would not be sent as a censor, he insisted, but as High Inquisitor for Security and Educational Standards, a charm of a title meant to soothe. Oversight in wartime, not silencing. Protection, not propaganda. On paper, her mandate was to fortify the castle, review defensive curricula, ensure that no reckless headmaster endangered children with unvetted plans. The Hogwarts Board of Governors fractured along that line. Some, remembering the Chamber of Secrets and the Basilisk, welcomed a ministry presence, arguing that even Dumbledore could err, and that external scrutiny might save lives. Others, older and more attuned to the cycles of history, feared that inserting a political operative into a fortress preparing for a very real siege would blunt Dumbledore's ability to act quickly when the graveyards began to fill again. In the end, the vote did not keep her out. It merely changed her mask. Umbridge still arrived in a cloud of pink and perfume. But now she spoke in the grave tones of security, of standards, of safeguarding children from panic. Officially, she came to strengthen defenses. Quietly, her brief was unchanged. Keep the narrative controllable. Keep fear pointed away from the Ministry. Keep Harry and Cedric's shared truth from hardening into open rebellion. The question was not whether she would interfere. It was how her new, sanctified authority would twist the coming battles inside the castle, and whose preparations she would sabotage first. Hogwarts changed without changing its stones. The banners stayed the same. The sky above the enchanted ceiling moved from blue to grey as it always had. But the air was different now. Charged with a question that would not leave the corridors. If Cedric Diggory had died naming Voldemort, what did that make this place? The debates began in classrooms, not corridors. In McGonagall's Transfiguration lessons, hands that once rose to ask about switching spells now rose with careful, trembling challenges. Professor, if Cedric said he who must not be named is back, and Harry says the same, why does the Ministry statement say only that dark magic was involved? A simple question. A long, heavy silence. Then McGonagall's answer, clipped and formal, that the Ministry's wording was its own affair, and that they would focus on mastering human to animal transformations. But her eyes lingered on Cedric's empty seat. This is important. In Charms, Flitwick heard the same arguments take a different shape. Hufflepuffs quoted Cedric's last words as though they were a spell, a binding charm of testimony, weighing them against the Ministry's careful evasions. Ravenclaws dissected the phrasing of every official notice, treating each sentence like an arithmancy problem, measuring how much truth could be concealed in so many hedged clauses. Gryffindors simply said what they believed, Harry had never lied about grave things, and Cedric had never sought glory. Two stories clashed over every desk: war is coming or war is contained. House lines, once mostly about Quidditch and petty rivalries, hardened into something more dangerous. Hufflepuff, whose champion had become a martyr, found a new, quiet ferocity. Badges with Cedric's initials appeared on robes, not as decoration, but as declaration. They whispered about organizing patrols, about learning defensive magic beyond the syllabus, about making sure no one else died surprised. Gryffindors circled Harry without fanfare, the loyalty of a house that had buried too many of its own. Slytherins watched, Slytherins listened. They tested each version of the story the way their parents tested alliances at dinner tables, weighing which narrative would leave their families most alive when the dust settled. The staff felt it. They adjusted. McGonagall began assigning more complex shield transfigurations, framing them as an academic challenge while quietly correcting wand grips that were more appropriate for combat. Flitwick lengthened dueling drills, calling them coordination exercises, yet pairing students who argued about Cedric's death so they would learn, wand to wand, what it meant to trust someone under pressure. Lily was a charms prodigy, and Flitwick had known what it meant to train brilliance for war. He recognized the same shadow now passing over his classroom. Then Umbridge arrived as the Ministry's answer to a question it refused to name. She could not deny Voldemort outright. Cedric's grave and the echo of his final words made that impossible. So she chose a different story. The Dark Lord might be stirring, yes, but the Ministry had a plan. The Ministry had everything under control. To doubt that control, to prepare beyond its approved curriculum, was not prudence. It was disloyalty. Her lessons became acts of erasure, theory instead of practice, reassurance instead of readiness. She called panic a kind of treason and wrote it into detentions, carving the message into skin as if she could carve it into history. Not Dumbledore, who had rebuilt the Order in secret, not Hagrid, who had seen giants move in distant mountains, not Sirius, who had measured the Ministry's fear from the shadows. Only Umbridge, who insisted that the right words, repeated often enough, could make a resurrected monster into a manageable rumor. Hogwarts was no longer a school at the edge of a hidden war. It had become the battlefield on which the war's meaning itself was contested. In whispered arguments behind curtains, in essays that said one thing and implied another, in detentions that punished not actions but belief, the question was no longer whether Voldemort was alive. The question was what his return was allowed to mean. And as autumn deepened, it became clear that the first victories and first betrayals of this new conflict would not be counted in bodies, but in stories that hardened, one conversation at a time, into the truths students were willing to fight for. Far from Hogwarts, far from the whispered arguments in common rooms and the quiet hardening of student loyalties, another conversation about truth was unfolding in a place without windows or clocks. It began with the crack of apparition and the stink of graveyard earth still clinging to cloaks. Voldemort listened. The Death Eater who had fetched the cup knelt, voice shaking, and described what should have been a clean story, A boy killed, a body returned, a tidy grave to anchor the Ministry's denial. But the tale would not stay simple. Cedric Diggory had not died at once. Cedric had spoken. Cedric's name was now bound to Voldemort's in public, not as a rumor, but as a dying declaration repeated in the hospital wing and in the corridors of power. This is important, because in the original story, Voldemort's greatest weapon after his resurrection was not a spell, but uncertainty. A year of shadows. A year in which the grave at Little Hangleton held only bones and questions, while the living world argued about whether he was truly alive at all. Now, in this altered plan, that cloak of doubt had been torn. The grave was empty of ambiguity. The Hufflepuff boy had filled the silence with names and details and the shape of a wand raised in a graveyard lit by green fire. Voldemort's fury was cold at first, then incandescent. He did not rage at himself. He did not question the arrogance that had turned a Triwizard cup into a portkey without redundancy, without patience, without considering that a single killing curse might not fall flawlessly in the chaos of returning flesh. He turned instead on the servant who had carried the cup, who had watched the curse strike, who had failed to ensure that Cedric's death was clean, quiet, unremarked. The punishment was methodical. Bones broken with deliberate precision, nerves set alight with Cruciatus until the man's screams were hoarse and thin. Not Dumbledore, who had believed in second chances, and not Hagrid, who had carried children out of danger, would have recognized anything human in Voldemort's gaze as he watched. The Dark Lord saw only a flawed instrument that had allowed a witness to crawl back into the light. When the screaming finally stopped, new orders were given. Recruitment would accelerate. Oaths would be taken in blood rather than ink. Those who had been at Hogwarts that night, who had seen Cedric alive and then seen what he became, were to be watched, catalogued, and, where necessary, erased. Quiet accidents. Vanished memories. A slow, invisible pruning of anyone whose testimony could harden into unbreakable truth. At the same time, probing strikes would begin against the Ministry's defenses months earlier than in canon, testing aura response times, mapping the corridors of the Department of Mysteries, measuring how quickly Cornelius Fudge could be driven from frightened denial into open repression. If the war must step out of the grave sooner, it would do so with teeth bared. In the Lair's central chamber, a snake coiled near the hearth as Voldemort stood before a low, unnatural fire that burned with a sickly, serpentine hue. Shadows twisted on the stone like living replicas of the dead. He watched them, listened to the faint hiss of Nagini's breath, and understood that secrecy had been stolen from him by a boy who refused to die on schedule. "Very well," he whispered, voice sliding into Parseltongue and back again. If the world insisted on believing in his return early, then belief itself would be punished. Fear would be taught immediately, not delayed. The next time his name passed between wizarding lips, it would not be as a question. It would be as a warning. The first attack came on a Tuesday, not a grand battle. Not a marked date in any history book. A small house on the edge of a Muggle town, curtains drawn against the rain, a children's drawing of a dragon blue-tacked to the kitchen wall. The Digby family had no famous name, no ancient vault, only a Muggle-born mother who had once sat in Hufflepuff and believed, with the stubborn optimism of her house, that the Ministry would keep its promises now that the truth was out. They were wrong. The wards snapped like bone. Green light in the hallway, a slicing curse through the photograph frames, a child's scream cut off mid-syllable. It was not a raid for information. It was an execution, staged as a message, the dark mark hanging over a suburban street where no one knew what that skull and serpent meant. This is important. Voldemort was no longer hoarding terror for a later reveal. He was spending it freely, burning it into the night sky, while the Ministry still had memoranda half-drafted about heightened vigilance. The second strike was quieter and in some ways worse. 2 auras on routine patrol along the Welsh border talking about revised protocols and Cedric Diggory's testimony, never making it to the end of the sentence. The ambush was surgical. Anti-apparition fields. A buried curse that turned the ground itself to grasping hands. One aura dead before he could raise his wand, the other left cruciated and alive long enough to crawl back and describe masked figures who moved with drilled precision rather than desperate improvisation. War had begun while the Ministry was still holding meetings about whether to call it that. Not Dumbledore, who had reformed the Order with grim efficiency, had expected the tempo to shift this fast. Not Hagrid, who had always imagined the first attacks as echoes of the last war, had pictured giants and dragons, not targeted murders on back roads. Plans that were meant for 6 months, hence were dragged forward in 6 days. Safe houses half-witted had to shelter children. Recruitment letters that were supposed to be whispered over Christmas were sent by Phoenix Fire in June. Then Nocturne Alley burned. The cursed fire began as a thin blue line beneath a shutter, a charm uncoiling like a living thing. It did not spread with natural logic, it leapt from object to object that had once tasted dark magic, turning heirloom cabinets and illicit artifacts into conduits. Shopfront glass melted into weeping faces. The grave of old certainties, they will start slowly, we will have time, was empty. The alley had always been a shadow, but now the shadow screamed. The Daily Prophet could not pretend this away. Headlines shifted in a fortnight from security concerns after isolated incidents to dark activity confirmed in London. The capital letters doing the work that the unsaid name did not. They still avoided Voldemort, clinging to euphemism like a charm against reality, but the photographs on the front page, blackened brick, aura stretchers, the faint outline of the mark in a cloudy sky, told a story with brutal clarity. The psychological turn was immediate. Cedric's grave was still fresh, his parents still accepting casseroles and condolences when public opinion swung from uneasy debate to hollow-eyed fear. The slow boil of denial that had once defined this period never materialized. People who had argued in pubs about whether Harry Potter exaggerated now spoke in low voices about evacuation plans and how quickly they could get their children out of Britain if the worst came. This is important. When a society skips denial, it does not become brave overnight, it becomes brittle. Wands were kept on bedside tables. Old grudges were buried not out of forgiveness, but out of triage. Even those who had derided Dumbledore now owled him in the night, asking for wards, for advice, for any sign that someone, somewhere had a plan. And in the middle of that rush, ministries scrambling, the Order fighting while still assembling itself, Hogwarts trying to remain a school instead of a fortress, one question began to whisper through the ranks of both sides. If this is only the overture, what has Voldemort reserved for the true opening of his war? If the graveyard was the overture, Severus Snape was the instrument no one yet realized had been tuned for a different performance. The grave was empty of denial now. Cedric Diggory was alive enough to speak, and his testimony made every whispered warning solid, heavy, irrefutable. This is important. Because when the dark mark burned that night on Snape's forearm, he did not return to Voldemort under a cover of general disbelief and ministry complacency. He apparated into a circle of robed figures who already knew the world above them was shifting, who had heard that the Hufflepuff boy had not died as cleanly as planned, who had seen the first cracks in secrecy appear before the war had even properly opened. Voldemort received him with that thin reptilian courtesy that passed for favor. A tilt of the head, a soft word, a probing silence. Snape bowed lower than he had in years, the mark on his arm a burning brand of renewed allegiance. Even as he calculated the new danger, Dumbledore no longer cried in the wilderness. He had a witness. He had a story that matched Harry's in every grave detail. He had, for the first time since Godric's Hollow, public backing for the truth. The Death Eaters felt it. They watched Snape with eyes that remembered Azkaban and trials and the quiet, suspicious mercy of the Wizengamot. Someone had failed. Someone had allowed enough to slip that the boy had been taken, marked, and yet returned alive with knowledge he should never have carried back. Who had spoken? Who had hesitated? Who had a second master? Not Dumbledore, who had never knelt in this circle. Not Hagrid, who had never worn a mask. The list of possible traitors was short, and Snape stood at the center of it, his every careful word now weighed for hidden meanings, his every delayed response a possible confession. Back at Hogwarts, the other half of his life constricted. His meetings with Dumbledore lost their leisurely chessboard cadence. They became sharp, clipped conferences in shadowed offices and warded classrooms. No more theoretical discussions about what Voldemort might do once he stepped into the light. He was already there, and the headmaster's questions were brutal in their simplicity. Names, locations, timetables, how many, how soon, where first. Snape had less room for performance, less room for the cold, theatrical cruelty that allowed him to play the villain before students while feeding the order just enough to survive. Every piece of intelligence had to be more precise, more actionable, because the Ministry, cornered by Cedric's corroboration, either would act or would openly choose not to, and that choice would write itself into history like a curse. Bitterness coiled in him like a second dark mark. Cedric's survival had made the war honest. There would be fewer comforting lies, fewer replicas of peace propped up over a rotting foundation. Yet each step toward clarity made his own path narrower, higher, more exposed. A spy thrived in fog, he now walked a ridge lit by lightning. In the silence of his dungeon classroom, stone walls sweating cold, desks lined like gravestones, Snape understood the new arithmetic. Every lie he told Voldemort must now be larger, more elaborate, threaded with just enough truth to pass inspection. Every lie he told the Order must be equally bold, just plausible enough to justify his continued presence in two worlds that were finally, irrevocably, at war. He stood alone among the jars and shadows and remembered faces in photographs that no longer moved. The grave was empty, but the cost of that emptiness had settled on him. From this night forward, every deception would have to be bigger, brighter, more convincing than anything he had managed in the quieter canon year, and any misstep would not merely end him. It would shatter the fragile, terrible chance this louder war still had to be won. The grave was empty, but the castle was not. News of Cedric's testimony, of his torn and trembling account that matched Harry's word for word, moved through Hogwarts like a cold front. Doors did not slam so loudly in Harry's face. Laughter behind his back softened into wary silence. Belief did not arrive as faith. It arrived as fear. Open attacks began almost at once. A Muggle family in Dover found their house reduced to blackened stone. A minor ministry official vanished on the way to work. There were whispers of the Dark Mark over a Somerset village. This is important. The argument for practical defense no longer sounded like the ravings of a traumatized boy, it sounded like common sense. Yet the ministry's answer was not trust. It was control. Dolores Umbridge still came, pink and smiling and poisonous, but her brief was different. She was not there to insist Voldemort was a lie. She was there to insist that only the ministry could decide how children learned to face him. Defensive magic, yes, on parchment, in theory, under supervision, with signed forms and carefully worded decrees. Anything beyond that would be unauthorized militia activity. Hermione Granger listened to this new script, watched Harry's hands tighten on the desk, and understood the danger in a way even he did not. The story had changed, but the pattern had not. The ministry would always move too slowly, bound by committee and fear of public panic. She proposed Dumbledore's army not as rebellion against denial, but as insurance against delay. A hedge against the fatal pause between a dark mark in the sky and an owl-delivered memo permitting students to raise their wands. The membership changed with the world. Hufflepuffs came first, not just because Harry had spoken for Cedric, but because Cedric had spoken for Harry. They filed into the room of requirement with set jaws and shaking shoulders, driven by a grave that was not empty, by a boy they had loved who had died telling the truth. Ravenclaws followed, curious not about gossip, but about tactics, about how shield charms overlapped, how angles of attack could be calculated, how corridors could become funnels instead of traps, and then, quietly, Slytherins, not many, never in a group. A fourth year who had an aunt in St. Mungo's after a masked attack. A sixth year who had read old war records and knew which side lost the last time they trusted the ministry to keep them safe. They did not come to make friends. They came to be competent. The curriculum reflected this new, harsher clarity. Less time spent convincing anyone that Voldemort was back. The world outside the windows had already done that. More time on coordinated tactics, on shield formations that locked together like scales on a dragon, on evacuation drills that mapped every hidden staircase and portrait passage. Harry found himself shouting orders, assigning roles, running simulations of midnight raids on the dormitories. Not Dumbledore, who had once imagined children as symbols, had designed this. Hermione had. Lily was a charms prodigy, but here it was another Muggle-born girl who drew diagrams of crossfire and fallback points on stolen parchment. One night, after a particularly brutal exercise where half the room had ended up stunned on the floor, Harry looked around at the panting faces and understood. This secret group was no longer about believing him. It was about surviving what everyone now dimly sensed was coming, and about who they would be when the masks finally fell. And beyond the stone walls, in offices lined with parchment and fear, men like Cornelius Fudge were already drafting the next set of rules that would arrive too late. The rules arrived too late, but the summons did not. Harry was called to the ministry as in the original story, torn from Privet Drive and thrust toward a courtroom that had never been meant for schoolboys. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow. This is the thing that nobody knew. But another absence now haunted London, the absence of Cedric Diggory's future, and the echo of his last desperate message. Canon would have dragged him before the full Wizengamot for a single Patronus, treated the charm as a pretext, the boy as a problem, and the story as an inconvenience to be buried under parchment. This is important. In that other timeline, Fudge arrived eager to label him unstable, dangerous, a child corrupted by fame. In this one, the air of the High Chamber was already thick with a different kind of fear. They had all heard Amos Diggory. Not once, but many times. His grief had become a ritual in the atrium, in committee rooms, in the corridors outside this very hall, where he told and retold how his son had staggered back from the graveyard long enough to whisper the same name Harry had, Voldemort. He had described the dark mark above Little Hangleton. He had repeated Cedric's words until even those who wished to doubt could recite them. So when Harry entered, the eyes that turned were not merely curious or contemptuous. Some were calculating, some were openly sympathetic. A few old war survivors with haunted faces watched him as one might watch a key witness at a war crimes tribunal. They did not see a nuisance. They saw a boy who had stood where their nightmares said the Dark Lord would someday stand again. Fudge sat high above, robes immaculate, hands too tight on the arms of his chair. He wanted still to undercut Harry's influence, to chip away at the authority that came when both a Potter and a Diggory agreed on the same terrible truth. Yet every sharp question he had prepared now tasted of retaliation against Cedric's corroborator. How would it look if the Minister of Magic savaged the last living link to Hufflepuff's fallen champion? So the interrogation twisted. It became more measured, more formal. Madam Bones pressed him for detail about Dementors and about the graveyard, and several members actually listened. Not Dumbledore, who had always believed him. Not Hagrid, who had never doubted the boy he carried from the ruins. These were men and women who had once trusted the Ministry's line and now felt the ground tilt beneath them. Harry was still afraid, but he was also dimly aware that he had become evidence. A replica of Cedric's testimony, walking and breathing, his magic and memory now a resource to be mined. He was acquitted more decisively this time, the vote almost perfunctory, the whispers already shifting from discipline to security, from whether he had lied to what Voldemort's next move would be. And as he stepped back into the dim corridor, Harry understood with a chill that he had not simply left a trial. He had entered a different kind of war, one fought with headlines and hearings, where he was no longer just a boy, but an asset in someone else's plan. Somewhere far from the Ministry's marble, other pieces were already moving toward him. The first shift did not come with a scream. It came with a headline. In the days after the trial, the Daily Prophet did not yet dare to print the name that had turned the graveyard into a battlefield. Instead, cautious ink bled across the front page, dark disturbances in Europe, Ministry monitors, unrest. Cedric's death, once dismissed as a tragic accident of foreign magic, became deeply suspicious. A phrase that admitted nothing and implied everything. This is important. Language moved before policy did. They printed grainy, distant photographs of the Riddle grave, never saying whose grave it was, never naming the thing that had risen beside it. They spoke of ritual interference and unauthorized gatherings, of foreign agitators who might have tampered with the Triwizard Cup. Not Dumbledore, who had named Voldemort in the chamber and in the Wizengamot clear as a spell. Not Hagrid, who had sat at the back of the courtroom with his great hands clenched. The prophet wrote around them as if the truth itself were a curse that might detonate on the page. But the readers were not replicas. They were alive, and they could still choose. Subscriptions began to slip, one parchment form at a time. Owls returned with unopened issues tied resentfully to their legs. Advertisers, robe makers, broom companies, even Gringotts, with its ancient disdain for wizard politics, sent polite, brittle letters asking for reassurances that the paper was being appropriately vigilant. The prophet's ledgers told a harsher story than any editorial. Denial, it seemed, was bad for business. Inside that pressure, certain journalists smelled opportunity. Rita Skeeter, or someone very much like her, sharpened a quill and shifted her angle with predatory grace. If Harry and Cedric could no longer be painted as liars, they could be recast as omens. Tragic harbingers. Headlines changed, 2 champions, 1 graveyard. What did they see? The articles lingered on the pallor of Cedric's face, the tremor in Harry's hands, the way both boys had described the same wand, the same voice, the same impossible return. Fear sold. Fear always had. The new line was simple, elegant, and poisonous. Yes, something dark had stirred. Yes, the old terror might in some form be back. But the Ministry was in control. Cornelius Fudge appeared in carefully staged interviews beside senior aurors, speaking of containment, of targeted raids, of no cause for widespread panic. Panic, the prophet now suggested, was irresponsible. Dumbledore was praised as brilliant, of course, but also described as unyielding, radical. A man whose long war against the dark had perhaps left him too ready to see enemies in every shadow. Lily was a charms prodigy, and even she would have recognized the spellwork, not a shield, but a glamour cast over an entire country. The grave was empty of honest denial now. In its place stood reassurance, carefully constructed, gleaming like safety. Readers were told they could go about their lives, that the danger was distant, managed, almost theatrical. What happens to a war when people are invited to watch it like a show? The prophet's pages offered front-row seats to controlled dread, to curated terror, always bracketed by promises that someone else would pay the real cost. Denial had not died in that courtroom. It had simply mutated, softened into a more seductive lie, that the storm could be observed from the window without ever breaking the glass. And while wizards turned their eyes to the headlines, other eyes were already studying the blind spots those headlines created. Other eyes were watching the blind spots. Some of them were badger yellow. In the Hufflepuff common room, beneath the low earthen ceiling and the tangle of hanging plants, a new center of gravity had appeared. Cedric Diggory's photograph, once just another moving picture in a crowded frame on the mantel, now stood alone above the hearth, enlarged and reframed. Candles guttering beneath it in a makeshift shrine. Wax pooled like melted grief on the stone. His smiling, living replica looked down at them, forever mid-laugh, while the room learned to speak in hushed tones around his name. The younger Hufflepuffs came first. They clustered on the rug, knees touching, eyes wide, and they asked the question that had already become ritual. What did he say? What were his last words? The older students answered with the same grave cadence every time, as if reciting a spell. He believed, Harry. He said you were right. He said Voldemort. This is important. The story was told and retold until it hardened into litany, until even the first years who had never spoken to Cedric could have repeated his final breath from memory. Not Dumbledore, who had given his speech and vanished into strategy, knew what that repetition was doing to the soil of this house. Not Fudge, who had dismissed the graveyard as hysteria, understood that here, beneath the kitchens, denial had failed to take root. Hufflepuff was listening to a dead boy and treating his truth as law. Professor Sprout saw it. She moved among her students like she moved among her greenhouses, pruning despair, staking up courage where it sagged. She did not speak of war in grand terms, she spoke of preparation. If they were brewing, she quietly suggested potions that healed. If they were practicing, she recommended shielding charms, simple diagnostics, the kind of magic that kept people alive. She encouraged them to tidy the pantry until it held more bandages and dittany than anyone strictly needed. She reminded them, gently but relentlessly, to walk Muggle-borns back from class, to learn which corridors were safest, to make certain no one disappeared alone. Under her subtle guidance, grief became practical. Fear became a plan. It was in this atmosphere that a handful of older Hufflepuffs began to step forward when Harry and Hermione whispered about a defense group. They did not frame it as rebellion for its own sake. They framed it as continuity. Cedric's friend, a seventh-year girl with dirt permanently under her nails from Greenhouse 3, said it first. If Cedric's last act was to tell the truth even when it killed him, then their task was to live that truth long enough to make his death matter. They became quiet captains in the Dar, the ones who insisted they all learn stunning and shielding, yes, but also how to carry a wounded body, how to improvise a stretcher from cloaks, how to recognize the early signs of a curse that looked harmless until it was not. They drilled watch rotations for younger badgers walking back from evening practice. They wrote down everything Harry taught them, building a written record in case he did not survive. Not Hagrid, who had always thought of Hufflepuff as the gentle house, knew that its gentleness was calcifying into resolve. The grave was empty of Cedric's future, and they felt that absence like a physical weight. In this timeline, Hufflepuff was no longer the overlooked house in the corner of the hall. It was the house with a martyr whose story no one could quite bury. A house that understood, earlier than most, that the storm was already inside the castle walls. Slytherin noticed first. While the rest of the castle argued over headlines and statements from the minister, the children of the old families sat with the daily profits spread between them like a battle map. They did not read only the ink. They read the absences, the evasions, the way an attack in a remote village echoed a raid their parents never spoke of, but never quite buried. This is important. They saw the signatures in the pattern of attacks, a Muggle-born family vanishing near an ancestral manor they had visited as children, a Department of Mysteries clerk resigning after a quiet inquiry into forbidden artifacts, a werewolf pack driven north, not by chance, but by someone who understood how to clear a hunting ground before real war began. They knew that choreography. Their childhoods had been shaped in its shadow. The grave was empty of certainty in Slytherin House. The story of Cedric's testimony did not arrive there as a revelation. It arrived as confirmation that the tremors under their feet were not imagined. For some whose fathers had once worn masks and whose mothers still flinched at thunder, the recognition came with a grim, almost reverent satisfaction. The Dark Lord was alive. The old plan was unfolding again. Destiny, they told themselves, had merely been delayed. For others, the recognition tasted like ash. They remembered the First War not as glory, but as absence. An uncle who never came back from a business trip. A grandmother who stared at the fire and did not speak for days when October came. Not Dumbledore, who had rallied the Order. Not Hagrid, who had carried bodies from ruins. Not Sirius, who had rotted in Azkaban. It was quieter than that. It was the way their parents locked doors with trembling hands. In the Slytherin common room, the lake pressed against the windows like a dark, listening ear. Whispers moved through the greenlit shadows. Was Cedric's survival and sworn account a flaw in the Dark Lord's magic, a miscalculation that would soon be corrected? Or was it a warning, a deliberate mercy to test who would ignore the truth even when it stood breathing beside the boy who lived? There were names in those whispers. Daphne Greengrass, who watched her father's owl arrive 3 nights in a row and noticed that each letter smelled faintly of smoke. Theodore Nott, who traced the prophet's reports with a finger and marked, in his mind, which incidents matched the cadence of stories his father had told when he thought his son asleep. They did not speak of courage. They spoke of odds, of timing, of which side would offer a future that did not end in a grave or a cell. And yet, even there, Cedric's courage intruded. A Hufflepuff, a rival champion, a boy who had every reason to protect his own house's peace, had chosen to stand beside Harry and name the Dark Lord aloud. Lily was a charms prodigy. But Cedric's defiance was its own kind of magic, the charm of a simple, unembellished truth. One Slytherin girl, a half-blood whose name the prophet would never print, listened to that story and felt something in her calculations shift. If Cedric Diggory could walk into the graveyard of Voldemort's power and still speak, however briefly, then perhaps the safest plan was not obedience, but preparation. She approached a trusted Ravenclaw under the noise of a Quidditch celebration and asked, in a voice that did not tremble, how one might find the defense group Potter was rumored to be forming. She insisted on rules, no names, no proofs, no trace that could be taken home on her robes. She would not be alone. A boy whose family ring bore a serpent and a skull listened to his parents argue late at night about ministry decrees, heard fear under his father's anger, and began to attend the clandestine meetings as well. Hood up, wand steady. He did not renounce his house. He did not speak of loyalty. He watched. He learned. He prepared for a war he now accepted as inevitable. Cedric's corroboration did not turn Slytherin into a house of heroes. It did something colder and, in its way, more dangerous. It stripped away the comfortable fiction that they could remain neutral while the Dark Lord and Dumbledore contested the world above their dungeon. Their choices grew starker. Their excuses grew thinner. Their fear at last became honest. And honest fear, in a house trained to turn fear into strategy, would change how the next moves on the board were made. Honest fear did not stay in Hufflepuff. It leaked. It climbed staircases and slid under doors, and within days it reached the one place in the ministry that pretended to be above fear entirely: the Department of Mysteries. The Unspeakables listened to Cedric Diggory's testimony on a crackling, silver-rimmed, pensive strand, replaying the graveyard again and again. A boy bound, a Dark Lord reborn, a wand raised, a killing curse diverted, not by chance, but by design. This is important. For men and women whose lives were spent charting the slow, cold mathematics of fate. A Hufflepuff's dying corroboration was not sentiment. It was data. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow, but the Hall of Prophecy was not. Row upon row of glass orbs waited in the dark, each one a sealed story about what magic believed might happen. Fudge, rattled but not ready to stand in the light, signed a quiet directive instead. More wards. More aura patrols that never appeared on paper. More layers of obfuscation around the aisle that held a particular dusty orb marked with an SPT to APBD and Dark Lord. Not Dumbledore, who had argued for open acknowledgement, who had pressed for public mobilization, knew the full extent of those new protections. Not Hagrid, who had trusted that the Ministry was useless rather than actively cautious. Not Sirius, who had spent years in a cell built by that same institution, would have believed they could move so swiftly when protecting their own secrets. Yet the unspeakables moved. Because they had been waiting. In their windowless rooms, they debated in low, controlled voices. Did Cedric's corroboration fulfill any of the old omens, the scattered fragments they had cross-referenced for years? Was the rebirth in the graveyard the true trigger of the Potter prophecy, or merely an acceleration? A forced advance of conditions that would have ripened more slowly. Lily was a charms prodigy, and somewhere in their hidden files were records of her experimental protections, her work on sacrifice and survival. They laid those parchment notes beside the Penjeeve memories and asked, not for the first time, whether the prophecy was describing a boy, a Dark Lord, or a particular configuration of magic itself. Voldemort felt the change almost as quickly. His spies in the department could not name every new barrier, but they described the scent of fresh wards, the faint pressure in the air of the hall, the way some shelves now resisted even being looked at. He understood at once, if the Ministry was beginning to take old predictions seriously, then the window in which he could act unseen was narrowing. He had intended to wait, to let Harry grow more isolated, more discredited, more desperate, to turn the boy's mind into a grave for his own sanity before prizing it open. Now he revised the plan. He would have to reach for the prophecy sooner, even at higher risk, before these quiet precautions hardened into something more absolute. So he leaned harder into the connection between them. Dreams that in another timeline would have come in winter began in late autumn, seeping into Harry's sleep with a violence that felt less like vision and more like invasion. Corridors of stone, a door that would not open, shelves stretching into darkness. Each night, the images sharpened, as though the hall itself were being dragged closer to the boy rather than the boy to the hall. In the Department of Mysteries, one glass orb on a high shelf began to glow a fraction brighter, its milky depths swirling as if disturbed by a distant breath. No unspeakable touched it. No aura knew it was there. But the magic inside it stirred, aware in some blind, preconscious way that the future it contained was being pulled forward, its careful pacing ruined by a dead Hufflepuff's last stubborn truth. Somewhere above, Harry Potter woke with a hand to his scar, heart racing, with no idea that the thing calling to him had just become more urgent and more dangerous than in the story he thought he knew. Down in the house that had been a mausoleum long before it became a headquarters, Sirius Black paced. Grimmauld Place was awake early this time, its walls humming with wards and whispered reports, because Voldemort had not been allowed the luxury of secrecy. The war had started too soon, and Sirius was still in prison. Only now the bars were made of ancestral portraits and dust. The grave was empty. This is the thing that nobody in the wider world knew. that no Daily Prophet headline could print, there had been no long year of disbelief, no slow drip of character assassination. Cedric Diggory's last stubborn truth had forced the Ministry to acknowledge what it feared. Voldemort was alive. The story had leapt from graveyard to Wizengamot in weeks, and Grimmauld Place became a war room while Hogwarts was still clearing Triwizard debris from the pitch. Sirius heard the reports and burned. Attacks on Muggle-born families, disappearances in Nocturne Alley, a raid on a minor ministry office that left 3 Aurors dead. He had spent 12 years in Azkaban for a crime he had not committed. Now, when there were real crimes to answer, he was ordered to stay inside. Not Dumbledore, who had always believed in the slow, careful move, the long game. Not Hagrid, who had carried Harry from the ruins and thought that was enough. Not Sirius, who had wasted too many years already, could bear the thought of waiting while other people's sons died. Cedric's death sat on him like a second set of chains. He saw James in that boy's smile, saw himself in the way Cedric had turned back for Harry, and he knew, with the brutal clarity of hindsight, that adults had failed them both. Failed James at Godric's Hollow. Failed Cedric in a graveyard where the plan had been a tournament, not a war. Survivor's guilt layered upon survivor's guilt, until even the Black family tapestry seemed to accuse him. But Harry came. This is important. Not as a fugitive seeking a secret hearth, but as a recognized witness, a young strategist moving between Order meetings and Hogwarts corridors with Cedric's name as a shield. He and Sirius bent over the kitchen table with maps and lists, planning the lessons that were no longer an act of rebellion, but a sanctioned preparation. Harry spoke of training Hufflepuffs in shield charms first, of honouring Cedric by making his house a wall. Sirius listened, and for the first time since Azkaban felt almost useful. An earlier coordinated order changed the shape of every engagement, especially the Department of Mysteries. They knew Voldemort wanted the prophecy, they knew Harry was a target. So they rehearsed. They ran simulations in that dim kitchen, rearranging chairs for shelves, using cutlery as replicas of Death Eaters, mapping sightlines to keep no one near the veil. Lily was a charms prodigy, Dumbledore reminded them, and the Archway's magic was older than her work. They would not underestimate it. In this version, Sirius is assigned to the second wave, held back to guard the exit. His recklessness contained by a plan that assumes the worst. Perhaps he never reaches the Archway. Perhaps he lives to see Harry grow past 17. Or perhaps the accelerated war, dragged into the light by a dying Hufflepuff, simply finds another night, another corridor, another curse with his name on it. The story does not answer. It only asks, when time itself is forced to move faster, who does that really save? The war does not wait for children to come of age. It accelerates. It burns the calendar. By Easter of Harry's 5th year, the grave in Little Hangleton is no longer the only place where time has broken. The visions begin earlier. Sharper, Sirius on his knees beneath the high. Cold arches of the Department of Mysteries, ribs shuddering under the Cruciatus while masked figures watch in perfect, patient silence. This is important. Voldemort has learned from the graveyard and from Cedric's dying testimony, secrecy is no longer enough. If the Ministry will not deny him, it must be broken from within, and fear is a more obedient servant when it is born in the dark. Harry wakes screaming in March, not June. He wakes to a castle where more people believe him, where Cedric's name is spoken like a warning, not a doubt. The Dao is not a band of rebellious students now. It is an apprenticeship in war. They drill shields until arms shake, practice silent, stunning spells in abandoned classrooms, learn to move in pairs and cover each other's blind spots. Hermione tracks who can cast a reliable Protecco. Neville learns to anchor his stance against a curse's impact. Even the Hufflepuffs, who loved Cedric, train with a steadier, colder resolve, as if each spell is a promise made at a grave that in another story might have been empty. Dumbledore watches this and adjusts his plan. Not Dumbledore, who had once chosen isolation and secrecy, but a headmaster who now has auras slipping through his office fire at midnight, bringing reports instead of denials. Kingsley Shacklebolt and a handful of trusted colleagues listen to Harry's descriptions of the archway and the black curtain. They compare them to old, unspeakable rumours. The result is not a desperate, unsanctioned dash to London. It is a narrow, half-legal strike, threaded through loopholes in ministry protocol and the arrogance of those who still think the Department of Mysteries is untouchable. When the vision of Sirius being tortured comes, Harry does not run alone. He moves under orders. Dumbledore signals the order, McGonagall stalls Umbridge with a calculated confrontation, Shacklebolt arranges a patrol rota that leaves a gap exactly wide enough for one phoenix and a handful of broomsticks. This is important. Communication exists before the first spell is cast. The battle that follows is not safer. It is simply different. The Dao arrives with pre-arranged signals, coloured sparks to mark positions, shield teams rotating like practiced choreography between shelves of whispering prophecy orbs. The Order and the auras are close behind, not sprinting blindly, but fanning out to secure choke points. Around the Vale, they have prepared most of all. Moody and Shacklebolt throw up layered wards to blunt stray curses, translucent domes of magic that shimmer around the arch like replicas of a fallen temple. And yet, the Vale is hunger, not stone. Wards flicker, curses slip through. In the chaos, a familiar figure, laughing, reckless, alive in a way that has always defied grave and prophecy both, stumbles on the dice, boots skidding on broken glass. A jet of light strikes. The curtain billows. They teeter on the edge as spells paint the Hall of Prophecy in red and gold and sickly green. They fall, or they are pulled back. The story does not say. Not yet, they fall. Or they are pulled back. Either way, the Vale is no longer the only boundary that matters. The true line is drawn elsewhere, in ink and blood and names on a roll of the dead. If the Order goes into the Department of Mysteries with proof already in its pocket, they do not walk in blind. They know the trap is coming. They still go. This is important. Better planning means better shields, clearer escape routes, a stricter chain of command that even Sirius chafes against. It means someone has already reinforced the dice, already mapped the sight lines where a stray curse can tilt a life into the curtain's hungry dark. So perhaps Sirius does not die there. Not Sirius, who had rotted in Azkaban for 12 years and only just begun to feel alive again in a house that felt like a grave. In an accelerated war, he becomes what he was always meant to be, a field operative, not a prisoner. More missions, more exposure, more nights slipping through Nocturne in dog form, more duels in back alleys where no prophecy waits to be shattered, only bodies. Survival at the Ministry does not free him from death. It merely postpones the appointment and moves it to another battlefield. And if the veil does not take him, it may take someone else. A misaimed curse. A shove meant to save Harry that miscalculates momentum by a single step. Perhaps it is Tonks, whose metamorphomagus reflex fails her once. Perhaps it is Kingsley, who turns his back for a heartbeat to cover 2 children instead of 1. The story shifts, but the shape of the loss remains. Harry's grief is altered, not erased. He does not lose a godfather to a fall between worlds, he loses an ally to the same war that killed his parents and tried to kill Cedric. The wound is different, but it still bleeds. Earlier truth also drags the minor characters forward into danger. Aurors who, in canon, died in nameless skirmishes after Voldemort's open return may instead fall here, in these first contested months when the Ministry can no longer pretend ignorance. A trainee hit by a killing curse in a nocturne raid that never happened before. A cursebreaker from Gringotts drafted into a reconnaissance mission and never coming home. Hogwarts students who in the original story were injured by carrows or snatchers now find their scars arriving a year early in Hogsmeade ambushes and train attacks. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow, but the ledger of the dead is never blank. Cedric's proof has not conjured a bloodless timeline, it has only rearranged the columns. Some are saved, others, who were never meant to die so soon, step into their place. Lily was a charms prodigy, yet even she could not have devised a protection that kept the war from claiming its price. In war, earlier truth rarely means fewer graves. It means the names are written sooner and different. In this shifted timeline, Dumbledore does not have the luxury of pretending the world is still asleep. Cedric's testimony has dragged the war into the open, and with it, every secret Dumbledore once convinced himself was merciful. This is important, because the lie he has been telling is not only to Harry, it is to himself. In canon, he will one day sit in his circular office and confess that he delayed the prophecy to preserve Harry's childhood, to hold back the grave weight of destiny for one more school year at a time. He will admit that he feared Harry's burden, and that fear made a coward of him in the quiet, private ways that never make it into the history books. Not Dumbledore, who had faced Grindelwald. Not Dumbledore, who had watched too many children die. Yet here, with Cedric's grave still fresh in the earth and the Ministry forced to acknowledge Voldemort as alive, that justification rots faster than wreaths on a headstone. Harry is already a symbol. The boy who lived has become the boy who returned with witness. The Daily Prophet cannot paint him as delusional when Hufflepuff's champion has corroborated every detail before collapsing. The war is no longer rumor, it is headline. Under this harsh light, the old plan of delayed revelation, of keeping the prophecy locked in a silver stand until Harry is older, stronger, less breakable, begins to look less like protection and more like evasion. So the conversation comes earlier, not in the wreckage of 5th year, but in the stunned, echoing weeks after the 3rd task. Harry sits in the high back chair before Dumbledore's desk, robes still smelling faintly of graveyard smoke and priori incantatum. The office is quieter than he remembers it ever being. Fewer trinkets hum, more shadows gather. Dumbledore does not circle the point. He lifts the shallow stone basin, shows Harry the swirling memory of Sybil Trelawney's voice. He lays out the prophecy in measured words. A child born as the 7th month dies, marked as equal, power the Dark Lord knows not. He names Voldemort's choice. He names Harry as the one who must meet him. Then he does something else. He speaks of Cedric. Cedric's presence in the graveyard was not foretold, he admits. Cedric's death was not written in any orb. Yet his final, halting confirmation in the hospital wing, his insistence that Harry spoke the truth even as the life left his body, has accelerated everything. The Order is reforming in weeks, not years. The Ministry is fracturing now, not slowly. The path that once twisted in secrecy has been forced into the open road. Harry's reaction is not simple. How could it be? Anger comes first, hot and sharp, at being shaped into a weapon by words spoken before he was born, at realizing that even Dumbledore had a plan that treated him as necessary sacrifice. Gratitude coils with it, quieter but real, because at least the story is being told now, not after another year of lies by omission. And beneath both, a deeper grief for Cedric. Not only the boy who died, but the boy whose death has dragged this truth into the light ahead of schedule. The pattern interrupt comes when Dumbledore's voice, usually so controlled, actually breaks. He confesses that he hears Cedric in his sleep, repeating that Harry is not lying. That he cannot bear to stand by another bed and watch another child die ignorant of the forces moving around him. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow, he says softly, but the graves that follow have been full. Cedric's last words have ended his pretense that Harry can be kept in the dark. And in that admission, the balance of trust between them is rewritten. Fragile and incomplete, but finally honest enough to change what comes next. The balance of trust is rewritten, and with it, Dumbledore's timetable for the war. The choice he has been postponing for years can no longer be deferred. The luxury of waiting is gone. Voldemort has killed a Hogwarts champion in front of Ministry witnesses and then moved through the world as if he has nothing to hide, as if the grave and the stadium and the Ministry itself are merely different stages for the same performance. This is important. The old argument for caution, for delay, for gathering more evidence before striking at the Dark Lord's immortality, collapses under the weight of Cedric's proof. Denial was a shield, Cedric shattered it. Dumbledore can no longer justify allowing a creature who treats murder as a public declaration to keep his anchors in place. So, at the end of Harry's 5th year, the story changes. Not in a quiet office with a pensieve and a withered hand a year from now, but in a sun-struck, dust-moted room where two people who have both buried too many children sit across from one another and speak the word that has haunted Dumbledore since the ring: Horcrux. He does not give Harry every detail. He does not describe, not yet, the ring on the table like a fragment of a curse given shape. But he shares the outline of his plan. The truth that Voldemort has torn his soul. That objects must be found and destroyed, that this is not Dumbledore's burden alone. He frames it with deliberate care as a joint mission born from Cedric's grave, not a secret quest Harry stumbles into by accident. Harry is younger, less magically polished than the boy who in another story would stand on the rock above the sea in his 6th year. But he is also more awake. Cedric's last words have burned away the illusion that adults will always arrive in time. When Dumbledore invites him to the cave, Harry does not think he is being honored. He understands he is being conscripted. The two of them go earlier, the boat scraping against black stone, the green potion breathing in the basin like something alive. Harry's spells are rougher at the cliff face, his non-verbal magic less reliable, but his mind is steadier. He knew this was coming. Cedric's legacy has been a year of preparation rather than a single night of shock. The cost, however, is paid in Dumbledore's body. The cursed ring still takes his hand, or another Horcrux does. The exact artifact is less important than the consequence. The poison in the cave comes sooner, the injuries layer earlier, and the headmaster's remaining time contracts. Draco's task in 6th year is assigned against a backdrop of a headmaster who is already visibly failing months ahead of schedule, and the Dark Lord's instructions sharpen accordingly. Snape's unbreakable vow becomes more dangerous, more immediate, because the window in which Dumbledore might quietly arrange his own death has narrowed. Every misstep is amplified. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow, but Cedric's was not, and that single difference pulls the entire endgame forward. Both sides are forced into motion before they are ready. Plans that once unfolded over years must now be compressed into months, into weeks, into nights, like the one on the astronomy tower, where someone will have to decide whether to cast a killing curse sooner than they ever intended. And in that compression, something else is dragged to the surface. Something Dumbledore has avoided naming even to himself. What it truly means that Harry is tied to Voldemort more intimately than any Horcrux. Because if the hunt has started early, what happens when they reach the final piece too soon? 6th year does not begin with whispers. It begins with wards. The castle does not simply feel ancient now, it feels armored. Lines of magic hang in the air like faint auroras, shimmering over doorways and windows, veils of light that prickle against skin and soul. At the gates, auras stand in formal rotation, wands bared, eyes hollowed by too many late watches. Trunks are unshrunk and unpacked under detection charms, pockets are emptied, even owls are scanned. This is important. Hogwarts has become a fortress that remembers it has a graveyard. The students feel it first in their throats, in the way laughter catches and dies when a patrol of redrobed auras turns a corner. The story of the graveyard is no longer a contested rumor. Cedric's echoed testimony, preserved in Dumbledore's pensave and replayed before the Wizengamot, has made denial impossible. The truth is alive in ministry records, in prophet headlines, in the frightened glances of parents at platform 9 3/4. Not Dumbledore, who had once tried to shield children from the full weight of war, not anymore. He has given up the luxury of pretending school, and siege can be neatly separated. Under such scrutiny, Draco Malfoy's mission curdles into something uglier. In canon, his plan was desperate. Here, desperation is forced earlier, sharpened by aura rotations and reinforced doors. The vanishing cabinets become not a clever secret, but an obsession he must guard against layered detection charms and random staff inspections. Each failure pushes him toward riskier acts, cursed hinges that nearly crush a group of second years. A poisoned batch of pumpkin juice meant for Slughorn that sends 3 Ravenclaws to St. Mungo's instead. Collateral damage ceases to be hypothetical. Children bleed for a plan they never chose. Harry watches the pattern form like a constellation only he is willing to name. An attack in a corridor Draco had been seen surveying. A wardrobe sealed and then mysteriously unsealed despite new wards. A whispered argument between Malfoy and a spectral, furious, moaning Myrtle. In a Hogwarts already under siege, his insistence that Draco is an active Death Eater agent no longer sounds like paranoia. McGonagall listens longer. Tonks, on a rotating guard assignment, quietly checks his timelines. Even Ron and Hermione, exhausted by the constant threat, admit that the pieces fit too neatly to ignore. Validation does not bring comfort. It brings fear. In the staff room, the strain is visible in the set of shoulders and the way teacups rattle against saucers when distant booms echo from the renewed perimeter wards. Snape moves like a man walking 3 parallel graves. As head of Slytherin, he must shield his house from Ministry suspicion and from their own parents' expectations. As defense professor, he drills countercurses into trembling hands while pretending not to care who lives. As double agent, he threads a line between Voldemort's demands and Dumbledore's plan, reporting on Draco while subtly sabotaging him, knowing that one misstep will end with a dark mark flaring and a castle's defenses tested from within. Lily was a charms prodigy, and the layered protections she once discussed with Dumbledore in abstract are now etched into stone and sky, woven into the very air Harry breathes. The walls hum at night. Sometimes they shudder, as if something vast has tested them and withdrawn. Lessons continue, essays are assigned, Quidditch practices are scheduled and then cancelled when the wards flare too brightly. The pretense of ordinary adolescence phrase. This is not a year of crushes and Quidditch cups. It is a year where children try to memorize potion ingredients while counting aura footsteps outside the door, where every joke sounds like a replica of an old life they no longer quite believe in. 6th year becomes a long-held breath. The sense that somewhere just beyond the fortified horizon, the final Horcrux and the final decision are waiting, and the walls will not hold forever. The long-held breath ends on a cold night. The astronomy tower is not a battlefield at first glance. It is a place of homework and whispered secrets, of telescopes and star charts, of children pretending the war is far away. But by the time Draco Malfoy forces 2 students into the room of requirement and vanishes into the dark, everyone at Hogwarts knows the story is already over the edge. This is important. Dumbledore returns from the cave not merely weakened, but hollowed. The cursed sea, the Inferi, the potion that strips away defenses, all of that remains. Yet in this altered year, the damage begins long before the Emerald Basin. He has spent months as a general, not just a headmaster, driving the Horcrux hunt with a ferocity sharpened by one graveyard boy who lived long enough to say clearly that Harry told the truth, not Dumbledore, who had always believed Harry. Now the entire Wizengamot has heard Cedric's faltering testimony, and the timetable has collapsed in on itself. So when he clings to the battlements, wandless, ribs aching from cursed water and cursed time, he is not simply old, he is spent. He knew this acceleration might kill him. He chose it anyway. The tower feels differently as well. Heightened security means more patrols, more staff in motion, more auras embedded among the shadows of the corridors. When the dark mark blooms above the castle, it is not a mysterious sign that must be interpreted. It is a confirmation flare, the shape everyone has been dreading over a school they no longer quite believe is safe. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow. Here, the sky itself becomes a kind of grave marker, a declaration that sanctuary is over. Snape's arrival is the pattern interrupt. In canon, the circle is tight, the witnesses few. Here, the staircase below is already clogged with bodies, McGonagall, a pair of exhausted auras, 2 prefects who disobeyed orders to stay in their dormitories. They do not reach the top in time to stop the unforgivable. they do arrive in time to see it. They see Draco's wand shaking. They see Dumbledore's eyes, still and strangely gentle. They see Severus Snape lift his wand and, with the practice of a man who has rehearsed his own damnation, speak the words. The green light throws replicas of their faces across stone and parapet. There is no ambiguity, no whispered theory, no comforting charm of ignorance. The wizarding world, already alive to the reality of Voldemort's return, interprets the fall differently. In the original story, the Dark Lord's open strike on Hogwarts is the final undeniable proof that he has risen again. Here, it is proof that he is winning. Harry's grief is a layered thing. He stands beneath the tower later, staring at the place where Dumbledore's body met the ground, and understands, with a clarity that feels like cruelty, that Cedric is part of this. Cedric's broken voice in the hospital wing. Cedric's name in the prophet. Cedric forcing the Ministry to admit that the nightmare is alive. Because of that, Dumbledore moved faster, pushed harder, drank that potion a year earlier than he might have. Harry has lost his mentor to the very urgency that was meant to save him. He cannot decide which hurts more, that Dumbledore chose this plan knowing the likely cost, or that Harry himself would have chosen the same. The dark mark hangs over Hogwarts as dawn approaches, sickly against the paling sky. It is not revelation. It is confirmation. The war everyone acknowledged has finally stepped into the center of the stage, and there are no more replicas of peace left to hide behind. The walls have not held. The last safe tower has become a silhouette against a sky that says, without mercy, that the nightmare has outrun them all. The last safe tower falls, but not in silence. It falls under sirens, under reinforced wards screaming as they crack, under the weight of a government that has been at war for a year and is simply out of breath. In canon, the Ministry's collapse is a revelation. One night of green fire in the atrium, one duel, one corpse, and the grave of denial is split open in a single shattering moment. Here, the grave was empty long before the end. This is important. The Ministry did not fall because it refused to see the enemy. It fell because it saw him, armed itself, and still could not hold. The transformation is slow, almost ritual. Aura headquarters expands into adjoining floors, whole departments are folded into security coordination, and memos begin to carry not just ink, but the faint metallic smell of fear. There are emergency drills in the atrium. Wands are checked at the door. The fountain's coins are quietly redirected to casualty funds. And Voldemort adjusts. If he cannot hide, he will hollow. His Death Eaters do not simply storm the gates, they seep through the mortar. An assistant in the Department of Magical Transportation misfiles portkey licenses so Aura strike teams arrive 30 seconds too late. A clerk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement delays warrants until safe houses have already been emptied. Files vanish. Witnesses recant under Imperius. Every minor failure in an Aura operation feels like bad luck until someone like Kingsley strings them together and sees a pattern shaped like a noose. Amelia Bones becomes the face of resistance. Earlier vigilance means she reorganizes her department months sooner, cross-checks personnel, audits security clearances, insists on double Veritaserum interviews for any new hire. For a time, it works. Arrests are made. A handful of masked figures are unmasked in public trials that make front-page headlines. Yet that visibility paints a target on her. In this story, she either lives longer, directing a besieged ministry like a general in a crumbling fortress, or she dies sooner, cut down in a targeted assassination designed not merely to remove a leader, but to break the spine of morale. Both possibilities hang over every corridor she walks. Not Dumbledore, who had warned them, not Hagrid, who had ferried Harry to hearings beneath a sky already darkening. Not Sirius, who had watched the Wizengamot posture while Azkaban's shadows lengthened. None of them could halt the slow militarization that made every office feel like a bunker and every bunker feel, eventually, like a tomb. When the breach finally comes, it is not a surprise attack. It is a final push against doors that have been buckling for months. The atrium statue is different now. No magic is might monolith of pure oppression, but a fractured memorial. Witches and wizards standing together, wands raised, their stone chipped and scorched from earlier skirmishes. Under Voldemort's new regime, that statue is not replaced with triumph. It is twisted into warning. The same figures are left in place, but bound in chains of obsidian, their raised wands snapped, their eyes enchanted to weep a slow, continuous trickle of water that pools like a shallow grave around their feet. By the time Harry, Ron and Hermione stand outside the visitor entrance, planning their infiltration, the Ministry is not an oblivious bureaucracy. It is a wounded animal, half occupied, half resisting, its corridors lined with locked doors and fresher plaques, names of auras, of clerks, of people who believed the truth as soon as Cedric spoke it and still died too late. The magic in the air is thick with old duels. Every lift they will ride has carried bodies. Their Polyjuice plan feels less like a heist and more like walking into a mausoleum that remembers. The building itself has a memory of every warning ignored and every warning heeded too late. And somewhere in that memory, something else is waiting for them, coiled in the dark, listening for the echo of Harry Potter's footsteps. The lift doors close behind them. The echo follows. It sounds like a grave being sealed in slow motion. Outside, the war has already caught fire. This is important. When Harry, Ron and Hermione finally step out of the burrow and into their own exile, they do not leave a world pretending to be peaceful, they leave a world already under siege. Dumbledore, forced earlier into honesty by Cedric's broken, radiant testimony, has spent his final year pouring truths into Harry that canon never allowed. Horcrux is not a whispered horror here. It is a syllabus. Harry knows more, not everything, but more. He has seen diagrams in Dumbledore's cramped hand, lists of suspected artifacts, speculative maps that smell of dust and sleepless nights. He carries not only the locket's photograph, but notes on the ring, the diary, the cup, the snake. Ron and Hermione have read them all, have argued over them by candlelight like students cramming for an exam whose failure will be measured in bodies. But Voldemort knows more as well. He knew the moment Dumbledore's hand blackened years earlier than it should have. He knew when raids struck too close to one hidden anchor, when cursed protections flared against probing spells that no ordinary aura would dare to cast. The grave was empty in more than one sense. The illusion of his untouchable immortality had been quietly buried, and he has dug it up in a fury. He moves things. He reinforces others. The cave grows teeth, additional wards, inferi that remember faces, water that drinks magic as well as flesh. The Lestrange Vault becomes a fortress within a fortress, layered with detection charms keyed not just to blood, but to fear. Nagini is kept closer, almost never out of sight. What does a monster do when he realizes his replicas of life can in fact be hunted? He coils tighter around them. So the trio walk into a world where both armies are already fully awake. Not Dumbledore, who had once tried to buy time with secrecy. Not Hagrid, who had once believed Hogwarts could be a shelter. Not Sirius, who had once dreamed of a quiet house and a godson at peace. None of them are pretending now. Patrols crisscross the countryside. Order scouts and Death Eater hunting parties sometimes clash within earshot of the same terrified village. Safe houses burn faster than Hermione can catalogue them. Grimmauld Place is booby-trapped by paranoia and legacy curses. The Tonks' home is watched. Even the burrow, that stubborn symbol of ordinary love, is ringed with detection spells that hum like a nervous heartbeat. Here, Cedric's memory is not a monument. It is a metronome. Harry still burns when he sees Snape in his mind, when he thinks of Bellatrix's laugh, but he remembers a boy who chose fairness over rivalry in a maze full of shadows. He refuses to divert their hunt for personal revenge. Every time Ron suggests a detour, Harry hears Cedric saying, "We'll take it together." Hermione, too, carries him. She hoards evidence the way others hoard food, duplicates of Dumbledore's letters, copies of testimonies, enchanted journals that will keep writing even if her hand goes still. If they fall, the story must remain alive. The truth must outlive their bodies. In this compressed war, the Horcrux hunt is no secret scavenger chase along the margins. It is a race through a burning world. Every hour marked by another name whispered in the Order's headquarters, another family displaced, another street stained. Every delay is measured in lives lost, and the clock, once hidden, now ticks where everyone can hear it. Hogwarts does not fall in a single night. It erodes, stone by stone, rule by rule, scream by muffled scream behind a locked classroom door. But this castle has been at war for years now, not months, and the children who walk its corridors are not the untested, bewildered students of another timeline. They are a generation trained for siege. The Carrows arrive with their usual repertoire of cruelty, but they meet corridors already mapped for ambush, secret passageways already warded, a student body that has been drilling shield charms and silent casting since Cedric's death first proved Harry's story. This is important. The Dar is no longer a handful of frightened teenagers learning to disarm. It is an underground militia that has grown up with the expectation of battle. Its members spread through every house. Its leadership practiced in disappearing under pressure and reappearing where it hurts. In this Hogwarts, Hufflepuff does not cower. The grave in the little cemetery behind the village is never far from their thoughts, even for those who have never walked there in person. The grave was empty of comfort, empty of sense. It became a wound that never quite closed. They whisper Cedric's name in the common room before slipping out to meetings. They carve a small badger into the underside of desks, add a silent C beside it, a charm of remembrance that glows faintly when Carrow magic thickens the air. Not Dumbledore, who had once praised Hufflepuff loyalty as a pleasant virtue, could have imagined how that loyalty would harden into something like steel. The Carrows sense it and hate it. Detention becomes a word that tastes of blood. Yet every time a Hufflepuff refuses to curse a classmate, every time a Ravenclaw calmly cites Cedric's testimony at the graveyard as the moment the truth became undeniable, the Carrows' attempts to turn the school into a laboratory of terror falter. fear spreads, but so does quiet, stubborn defiance, anchored to the memory of one boy who did everything right and still died. And Severus Snape stands at the apex of this pressure, a dark fulcrum between the occupiers and the occupied. He sees Cedric's face in the Great Hall portraits that have been subtly repainted by student hands, in the way Hufflepuff tables fall silent when his name is mentioned. Cedric's legacy is a living rebuke to every compromise Snape has made. Yet, if he allows it to flourish openly, the Carrows will redouble their efforts. So he does what he has always done. He weaponizes perception. Publicly, he punishes. He deducts points with vicious precision, assigns detentions that look severe on parchment but are quietly rearranged in practice. A planned Cruciatus lesson on a first year is abruptly redirected to a seventh-year veteran, whose mind he knows will not shatter. A Carrow's hand, raised to strike, meets an invisible ward that turns the blow aside, and Snape's cutting remark distracts from the misfire. He reroutes patrols away from hidden meeting places, alters timetables so the most breakable children are never alone with Amicus for long. He hears Cedric's name spoken as a vow in the corridors and, in the privacy of his office, grips the edge of his desk until his knuckles whiten. That name keeps the students from collapsing into pure terror. It also keeps his own failures freshly flayed. Was this what Dumbledore intended, he wonders, when he handed him the headmaster's office like a poisoned crown? The castle becomes less a school and not quite a fortress, something in between. A city under occupation, where curfew bells echo through stairwells and secret passwords travel faster than official decrees. The Carrows hold the timetable. Voldemort holds the ministry. But Cedric Diggory holds the memory of a moment when the world was forced to admit the war was real, and that memory moves like underground fire. The children walk to class beneath the eyes of Death Eaters, and yet, in the small acts of refusal, in the way they straighten when Cedric's name is spoken, Hogwarts itself seems to remember that it is still alive. The grave was empty of him, but his absence has become a kind of presence, a quiet, relentless insistence that the castle will bend but not quite break. Not yet. Cedric's name becomes a direction of travel. It is not only memory, it is a standard raised in a darkened castle, a quiet command to move forward when every corridor seems to end at a locked door. Neville feels it first in his bones. In the tremor of his wand hand, the night Amicus Carrow forces a first year to practice the Cruciatus on a classmate. He remembers Cedric on the Quidditch pitch, offering Harry a rematch after the Dementors, remembers the way Cedric had insisted on a fair start in the maze when he could have taken advantage. Fairness, not as politeness, but as a kind of courage. This is important, because when you have watched a boy that decent die in front of the entire school and then stand again, shaking, to tell the truth beside Harry, it becomes harder to accept your own cowardice as inevitable. Neville's growth in this timeline is not sudden. It is incremental, like roots widening under a grave. He hears the Carrows laugh. Hears a Hufflepuff girl sobbing apologies as she lifts her wand, and something in him refuses. Cedric had believed Harry when it was dangerous to believe, had stood in the hospital wing and repeated his story to anyone who would listen until even the most sceptical Ravenclaws fell silent. Neville straightens. He steps between curse and child. His voice shakes, but he speaks anyway, because he knew Cedric Diggory, and Cedric had been afraid and fair at the same time. Ginny understands the power of that story and weaponizes it. She moves through the common rooms and corridors with a plan that is half sabotage, half sanctuary. She tells Hufflepuffs in low, urgent tones that the boy who came back from the graveyard did so for all of them, not just for Harry. She reminds them that when Fudge tried to discredit the truth, it was Cedric's testimony that made the lies crack. "You think you are not fighters," she says, but Cedric was a Hufflepuff. Ordinary kind, he still walked into the dark. In the room of requirement, the magic listens. The walls answer the whispered invocations with color and ink and cloth. A banner unfurls over the fireplace for Cedric. Someone, no one quite knows who, scrawls "Believe the Dead" along a stone archway, the letters glowing faintly gold as if written with a Patronus. Near the entrance, where passwords are agreed and remembered, 3 words are etched in stubborn, unyielding script: "He named him first." Because in this world Cedric was the first student to stand in public and say Voldemort is alive, and that naming has become a kind of charm against forgetting. Not Dumbledore, who had always spoken in riddles. Not Hagrid, who had always loved Harry too openly to be believed by those who feared him. Not Sirius, who had been a fugitive story more than a man. It is Cedric's cross-house respect that stitches the resistance together. Hufflepuffs bring food and blankets, Ravenclaws share coded notes and listening spells, even wary Slytherins, who had admired Cedric's self-possession, begin to pass along rumors of patrol routes and Carrow tempers. The grave was empty of him, but his name has become a password. It means we saw, we believed, we will not pretend otherwise. In whispered councils beneath the castle, Cedric Diggory is a patron saint of ordinary bravery, a replica of what any of them might be if they choose correctly when it costs them everything. But there is another listening presence in Hogwarts. Colder than stone and older than the house banners, and it has begun to notice which name the children speak when they think no one hears. The castle had been listening. Now, at last, it answered. When Voldemort's army came out of the dark, they expected a school. They found a fortress that had been rehearsing its own siege for 2 years, every corridor a memory of whispered drills, every classroom a diagram of how not to die. This is important. The story of this night is not improvisation. It is execution of a plan. Secret tunnels that had once been smugglers' delights were mapped, warded, and where necessary collapsed. Fred and George had given up their last private routes, tracing them in glowing ink over McGonagall's desk until the castle's underbelly lay open like an anatomical drawing. There were no surprises beneath Hogwarts now, only choices. Some passages had been turned into evacuation arteries, charmed with guiding lights that would not go out. Others were dead ends, bait for Death Eaters who thought children still ran blind. The Dar did not scatter into heroic chaos. They moved in units, each with a leader who had drilled with them in abandoned classrooms and on wind-scoured lawns. Neville with a squad at the greenhouses, Parvati and Padma anchoring a rotating shield line at the main staircase. Justin Finch-Fletchley coordinating Muggle-borns who knew with terrible clarity what capture meant. They were not soldiers. They were students who had been allowed to imagine, in detail, what this night might require. Hufflepuff, more than any house, had built the quiet machinery of survival. In the kitchens, long tables were cleared to white-sheeted rows, becoming triage stations under hovering light orbs. Hannah Abbott ran a healing bay with Pomfrey, her wand steady as she sealed burns and splint bones, Cedric's name a silent metronome in her pulse. In the lower corridors, yellow and black armbands marked runners who ferried potions, bandages and messages along protected routes, keeping the supply lines alive while curses shattered stone above. Younger children did not wander, sobbing through chaos. Badgers with prefect badges and hastily learned calming charms shepherded them through pre-assigned paths, past walls that had been enchanted to absorb sound so panic would not echo. Cedric's house held the line not with spectacle, but with logistics, insisting that courage was also the refusal to let anyone be forgotten in a corner. Amos Diggory stood in the courtyard when the first wave hit, older, leaner, his grief hammered thin into something like iron. He had joined the wider resistance when denial became impossible. Not Dumbledore, who had always believed, but a father who had once demanded that the grave mean finality and had discovered, instead, that the grave was empty of the future he had imagined. He fought now not for revenge alone, but to honor the boy who had tried to tell them the truth while he still lay warm and dying in a foreign graveyard. Voldemort's forces met resistance from the first breath. Shield charms overlapped in pre-arranged lattices, retreat signals flared in colors everyone had memorized. Giants were led into kill box courtyards, their ankles targeted by synchronized blasting curses from windows above. Werewolves found their flanks harried by Patronuses that did not falter, because each caster knew exactly where to stand, exactly when to fall back. The Death Eaters had expected a rout. They found a castle that had been allowed to believe, and therefore to prepare. Every corridor said no. Later, when the shouting thinned to groans and the smoke settled in bitter layers, Harry walked through the battered Great Hall. The house banners hung scorched and torn, the enchanted ceiling a low, clouded bruise. Along one wall, photographs and moving portraits of the fallen and the honored flickered in uneven light, a hastily conjured memorial that tried to make order out of loss. Cedric's face looked out from the center of it, younger than the knight in the graveyard, smiling in Hufflepuff yellow. Around the frame, someone had tied a strip of black, another of gold. Beneath it, in cramped, determined handwriting, a line, "He believed him." Harry stopped. In the layered silence of the hall, with the dead and the living sharing the same air, he could feel the chain of decisions that had led them here, as tangible as the ache in his bones. Lily was a charms prodigy, and somewhere far from this room, a mother's forbidden work had once turned death into a replica and a shield. Cedric had used his last breath to drag truth into the open. Amos had chosen, finally, to stand where his son would have stood. How many lives in this room, Harry wondered, traced back to that moment when a boy in a graveyard chose to speak before the darkness closed his throat? How many names on these walls were here because one Hufflepuff refused, even in terror, to let the lie stand? He reached out, fingertips hovering just shy of the photograph's edge, and understood with a clarity that hurt that the war they had fought tonight was not only his inheritance. It was Cedric's, too. It was everyone's who had listened when the warning first came and had been willing to live for years, as though the worst might truly be alive and waiting. The castle creaked around him, ancient stones settling, as if the building itself knew that some deeper account had been balanced. Not in full, never in full, but enough that, for the first time since that graveyard, Harry could imagine that the dead were not only a weight, they were also a line of hands behind his shoulders, pushing him forward into whatever came next. The forest waited for him. Not the way it had the first time, full of whispers and centaurs and the sick metallic scent of unicorn blood, but as a kind of long, dark corridor he had always been walking toward. Each step away from the castle felt like a step past a threshold. Past safety, past childhood, past the boy who had come back from a graveyard carrying another boy's body and a story no one wanted to hear. The resurrection stone turned between his fingers like a decision made and remade. Once, twice, thrice, the charm answered. His parents came first, as they always did in his imagination, not as corpses from a grave, but as the living replicas memory could sustain: Lily's hair, James's glasses, the familiar tilt of a grin that did not quite reach the eyes. Sirius followed, lean and restless even in death. Lupin, worn and gentle, as if the war still weighed on his shoulders. They walked beside him, their voices low, their presence a soft distortion in the cold air. Yet there was another absence that pressed just as hard as their nearness. Cedric did not come. Could not come. The stone could answer blood and bond and the ancient gravity of family, but it could not summon the boy whose last act had already fixed him in the world in a different way. This is important. Cedric was a ghost of another order, not in the circle of the stone, but in the circle of what everyone now knew. Harry thought of the grave in the Diggory plot, of how Amos had stood at its edge and demanded justice until his voice broke. The grave was empty of doubt, at least. Cedric's Patronus in that graveyard, his testimony before the ministry, had spent his last breath on truth, pouring it into the world so thoroughly that even Fudge's denial had cracked. Harry's walk now felt like the echo of that choice. Cedric had trusted others to carry on the fight once his story was told. Harry trusted others to carry on once his life was given. He wondered, as branches clawed at his robes, what they would say in the Hufflepuff common room when they heard. Would his death feel like a continuation of Cedric's story, a grim, inevitable second chapter? Or would it feel like the universe had played the same cruel joke twice, targeting the boy who had stood beside their champion and then followed him into legend? Not Dumbledore, who had orchestrated so much, not Hagrid, who had carried him from one ruin to another, had changed the simple arithmetic of this walk. Harry no longer believed his death would be the first undeniable proof of Voldemort's evil. Cedric already gave them that. The war had moved past the question of whether Voldemort was alive. The question now was how many more graves would be needed to end him. In that rearranged calculus, Harry's surrender was not an argument. It was a conclusion. The trees thinned, the clearing opened like a wound. Voldemort waited, ringed by Death Eaters, by the cold geometry of wands and masks and expectation. Harry stepped forward with his parents and godfather and former teacher at his sides, and with one more presence that did not show as mist or shadow. Cedric walked with him, unseen. One more name in the chorus of the dead who had told the truth and refused to look away. Harry's hand closed around the stone, then opened. The figures faded, but the weight of them did not. He entered the clearing not alone, but as the endpoint of a line that had begun in another graveyard, with another boy who had refused to die silently. The plan, at last, was simple. End it. The war ended. Voldemort fell. The boy who had walked into the forest came back alive. And yet, when the smoke cleared and the bodies were counted, another reckoning began, quieter and more merciless than any duel. Because this world could not say it had not been warned. This is important. The new ministry rose from the ruins of the old one with a peculiar, choking knowledge, years before the Muggleborn Registration Commission, before the carved words on Muggleborn arms, before the bodies stacked like broken wands in Hogwarts corridors. Cedric Diggory and Harry Potter had stood in a graveyard and told them the truth. They had not been believed enough, or soon enough, or with the right kind of courage. The grave was empty now, where the ministry's excuses had once been buried. So the first great project of peace was not monuments or elections. It was inquiry. A lattice of truth commissions, formal and magical, spread through the ministry like a second, belated order. The earliest focused on the years after the third task, on the way fear had been dressed up as prudence and called policy. Witnesses came in waves, former auras, retired hit wizards, unspeakables whose oaths trembled on their tongues, and Amos Diggory. He sat beneath enchanted quills that scratched everything into permanent record and told, in a voice sanded down by grief and time, the story of his son's death and his own choices after. He spoke of Cedric's recorded words, the echo of a dying Hufflepuff naming Voldemort and command, of how he had clung to Fudge's reassurances because the alternative was unbearable. Not Dumbledore, who had warned, not Hagrid, who had believed Harry without question. Amos confessed that he had heard the truth and still tried, for a season, to live as though the graveyard were a nightmare that could be dismissed with a headline. From these hearings came law. From law, a different kind of vigilance. Charms were woven into international agreements requiring the monitoring of certain categories of dark magic, not as instruments of control, but as alarms that could not be quietly silenced. Departments once shrouded in secrecy were bound to publish threat reports, stripped of names but not of warnings. Protections for whistleblowers were spelled into statute and spellbook alike. Any witch or wizard who raised the alarm about existential threats could invoke an old Hufflepuff's name and trigger automatic oversight. Cedric became more than a face on a chocolate frog card. His last testimony, preserved in the Priori Incentum transcripts and the graveyard memories, entered the history of magic curriculum as required reading. First years copied out the lines where he described Voldemort's body, his followers, the green light meant for Harry. Older students visited a memorial in the ministry atrium where his words were etched into stone, not polished into heroics, but left raw. I saw him. He is back. Children grew up knowing that the dead had spoken and the living had hesitated. The guilt of this world was not ignorance, it was the long damning ledger of what it did, and did not do after a dying Hufflepuff told it the truth. And in the quiet that followed the commissions, another question began to surface, colder than any dark mark. What if there was a third warning? One they had not yet recognized as such? The third warning was quieter. It did not arrive with a dark mark or a screaming headline. It arrived years later in the way Harry Potter did not break. Canon Harry had been left to rot in a different kind of grave. A year of headlines calling him unstable, of whispers in corridors, of adults who looked away. The grave was empty, but the isolation had been real. a suffocating chamber where every doubt echoed louder because the world refused to admit the truth. In that world, he fought Voldemort with one hand and his own self-loathing with the other. Here, Cedric had spoken. Here, the Ministry had watched a Hufflepuff boy die telling the same story, and the lies had cracked early. This is important. Because when the war finally ended and the bodies were counted, Harry stepped into a world that had believed him when it still had a choice. He was not the mad prophet vindicated at the 11th hour. He was the boy they had listened to, and then still failed to save everyone. The anger was different, softer at the edges, less poisoned by the memory of adults calling him a liar. He still remembered Fudge's first flinch, Umbridge's saccharine resistance, the Daily Prophet's careful evasions. But he also remembered the commissions, the hearings, the way witches and wizards stood under Veritaserum and said, "Yes, we knew," Cedric told us, Harry told us. The rage that once would have turned inward, that corrosive certainty that perhaps he was broken, had less soil in which to root. What replaced it was heavier, survivor's guilt sharpened rather than dulled by validation. Every time he saw the names on the memorial, Cedric sat like a keystone. The boy who had died twice, once in a graveyard, once in every decision made after his warning. He visited the Diggorys often, not as a symbol, as a penitent. The house in Ottery St. Catchpool smelled of polish and old parchment. Amos moved like a man whose bones had been transfigured into glass. Mrs. Diggory kept a chair that no one sat in. Harry would sit at their kitchen table and tell them the parts of the story the official reports had turned into neat, bloodless lines. How Cedric had turned back in the maze. How he had said, together, how, in the graveyard, when the plan could have been to run, Cedric had instead drawn his wand and stood beside him. He spoke of the graveyard duel, of green light and phoenix song, of Cedric's voice threaded through priori incantatum like a fragile charm refusing to fade. He described how, later, Cedric's testimony had become a touchstone at Hogwarts, how Hufflepuffs told first-years that their champion had not been merely killed, he had chosen to speak when silence would have been easier. Harry insisted on that, again and again. Cedric was not just a victim, he was a witness who had carried the unbearable weight of being believed. Not Dumbledore, who had always been half-myth. Not Hagrid, who had loved Harry too openly to be trusted by cynics. Cedric had been ordinary in the way that made his courage impossible to dismiss. In the years that followed, when monuments were designed and histories drafted, Harry read every line that bore Cedric's name. He argued in committee rooms for a statue not of a fallen boy, but of a boy standing, wand raised, mouth open as if mid-warning. Lily was a charms prodigy, but Harry became something else, a guardian of memory. A stubborn editor of the story the world wanted to tell itself. He visited Cedric's grave alone. The stone was simple. The grass grew thick around it, fed by rain and the quiet footsteps of those who came to pay respects. Harry would stand there and feel the odd, dissonant knowledge that his own life had been shaped as much by this Hufflepuff as by the parents whose replicas had once lain in Godric's Hollow. He spoke aloud sometimes. Of Ginny. Of Teddy. Of the students who had lived because the war had accelerated and ended before it could consume another generation. He spoke of the nights he still woke hearing screams, of the way being believed had not spared him nightmares, only a certain kind of loneliness inside them. And always, beneath it, the recognition. His story and Cedric's were now braided beyond separation. The boy who lived, and the boy who died and spoke. For a few crucial seconds in a graveyard, Cedric Diggory had refused to stay dead in the way the world preferred its martyrs, silent, uncomplicated, unable to contradict anyone. Harry traced the carved letters with his fingertips and understood that his own healing would never be a clean scar. It would be this instead, grief shared rather than exiled, a life built in the shadow of a grave that had once been a warning and was now a promise that the truth, once spoken, could not be buried again. The wind shifted through the cemetery trees, carrying the faint echo of distant voices. Somewhere beyond this hill, another secret was waiting to surface, another buried choice that would make the story of this war even harder to forgive. History would later mark that hill as a hinge. In the first unaltered telling of this story, Cedric Diggory's role was brief, poignant, and almost immediately drowned beneath the rising tide of other tragedies. He died in a flash of green and echoing laughter, a name carved on a grave and then overshadowed by the boy who lived again, by the politics of denial, by the slow darkening of the sky. He was a warning, not a weight that could move the world. Here, he is the fulcrum. In this timeline, Cedric does not vanish into the footnotes of a history of magic essay. His testimony, dragged from the edge of death and preserved by magic that refused to let his last words scatter on the wind, becomes the moment the wizarding world is forced to look directly at what it most fears. This is important. Not Dumbledore, who had pleaded for vigilance, not Hagrid, who had repeated Harry's story with rough, aching loyalty. It is Cedric, Hufflepuff's champion, whose dying truth breaks the Ministry's fiction. The textbooks change first. Where there was once a paragraph on the Triwizard tragedy, there is now an entire sequence of chapters titled The Triwizard Incident, The Diggory Testimony, and The Crisis of Denial. Fourth years read transcripts of Cedric's recorded words beside Harry's, comparing the details of the graveyard, the circle of Death Eaters, the reborn body of Voldemort. They trace the political battles that followed, Fudge's faltering resistance, the Wizengamot sessions that turned on a single Hufflepuff's reputation, the first emergency measures that acknowledged a second war had already begun. The monuments follow. In this world, the memorial in Godric's Hollow is not only a statue of James, Lily, and their infant son. A second figure stands beside them, Cedric, wand raised, eyes turned not toward glory but toward warning. In the Ministry atrium, a later monument abandons the empty heroics of faceless witches and wizards. Instead, two names are carved together on black stone, Harry James Potter and Cedric Amos Diggory, designated not as saviors but as heralds. Children visit on school trips and learn that the Second Wizarding War did not begin with a prophecy, but with two boys in a graveyard and a government that almost chose not to listen. There is an irony that Hogwarts never quite resolves. Hufflepuff, the house most associated with quiet loyalty and steady unseen work, produced the boy whose final, amplified breath shattered the illusion of peace. The grave was empty of silence. It rang with his insistence that what he saw was real. Lily was a charms prodigy, and in some accounts, scholars whisper that the enchantments that caught and fixed Cedric's words owed something to her hidden work, to a different replica and a different lie. The stories braid together. In this world, when first years open their history of magic texts, they are taught a different definition of courage. Sometimes, the bravest act is not surviving. It is making certain that your last breath cannot be ignored, that your truth, once spoken, will keep the living from ever pretending they did not hear. Truth came earlier in this world. That is the difference. Not the absence of darkness, but the absence of plausible deniability. Cedric's corroboration did not prevent the war, it stripped away the comforting lie that there was still peace. When a Hufflepuff champion, prefect and Quidditch captain, stands in the hospital wing with grey skin and shaking hands and tells the same graveyard story as Harry, there is no easy narrative about hysteria or attention. This is important. The illusion dies before the first Daily Prophet headline can be drafted. The Ministry is not choosing between belief and disbelief. It is choosing between action and cowardice. And it must choose in public. So the war begins not with a whisper in Dumbledore's office, but with a Wizengamot session in which two schoolboys swear under Veritaserum that Voldemort is alive. Not Dumbledore, who had always expected this return, but the rest of the world is dragged forward months, perhaps years, in its reckoning. Auras are recalled. Dementors are watched more closely. Parents pull their children from Hogwarts earlier. The piece was already over. Cedric simply forced everyone to admit that the grave they had buried their fears in was empty. Yet being believed is not mercy. It is burden. Harry and Cedric's joint testimony becomes the hinge on which new plans swing, raids launched sooner, alliances tested sooner. Betrayals accelerated before some people are ready to face them. A werewolf who might have had one more quiet year is exposed now. An unspeakable who might have defected later dies in an early skirmish. Different deaths, different scars, different regrets. The story does not become kinder because the truth is heard, it only becomes sharper, more deliberate, less deniable. For Fudge and Dumbledore, this timing is a sentence. Fudge cannot hide behind ignorance. His legacy is no longer the man who did not know, but the man who knew and tried to manage, to bargain, to delay. He tightens control over the press, not out of disbelief, but out of terror of panic, and those choices etch themselves into history like a curse. Dumbledore, by contrast, loses the luxury of quiet preparation. He calls the Order together not in secret defiance of a blind ministry, but in open divergence from a government that has run out of excuses. His brilliance is no longer in seeing what others refuse to see, but in acting when everyone is watching, when every failure is traceable. This timeline shatters a comforting myth about warning signs. They were warned, they believed, they still bled. Knowledge is not the same as courage, and magic does not transform fear into action. Witches who nod soberly at Cedric's account still send their children back to school because the alternative is unthinkable. Wizards who sign up for patrols still freeze the first time they see the dark mark burning over a familiar roof. Cedric's story, in the end, is a meditation on timing, on how a few extra breaths in a graveyard can ripple outward into legislation, into funerals, into the shape of Harry's nightmares. Every early truth rearranges the battlefield, but never for free. The question is not whether being believed makes things better. The question is whose quiet, whose innocence, whose last unbroken year is spent to purchase that belief. And in the shadows beyond the headlines and hearings, someone else is watching this earlier awakening, adjusting a very different plan and deciding which pieces to move first. In the first days after the graveyard, people tell jokes because they are afraid. Hufflepuff, the house of leftovers, the house of lost property and lost causes, the house you end up in when the hat has nothing better to do. That is the story they have always told themselves to make the quiet seem small. But in this timeline, when the world asks who first stood beside Harry and said, "Yes, I saw him, yes, he is alive," the answer is not Dumbledore, who had already been dismissed as old and partisan and too invested in a particular version of the war. It is Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff's champion, Hufflepuff's dead boy. This is important. Cedric's word becomes the fulcrum on which denial breaks. He was known as fair to a fault. The student who would stop a Quidditch match for rain that disadvantaged the other team, who would call a foul against himself. Professors trusted him, younger students copied him. Even Slytherins, who sneered at his house, respected his precision. When that kind of boy says Voldemort returned, when his last coherent testimony is preserved by magic and replayed before the Wizengamot, the old jokes curdle on the tongue. The virtues Helga Hufflepuff prized were never showy. Loyalty, fairness, patience, words that sound soft until the truth becomes unbearable and someone must hold it without flinching. Cedric does not embellish. He does not seek glory. He simply describes the graveyard, the circle of Death Eaters, the cold of the dark mark burning through his skin, and the way Harry refused to run. In a war built on lies and replicas and masks, the steadiness of that account becomes a new kind of charm against confusion. Post-war, Hogwarts changes its map of who matters. When the Second War ends and the dead are counted, people begin to notice a pattern in the stories that survive. Again and again, in the hospital wing and in the rubble of the astronomy tower, there was a Hufflepuff first. The one who pulled a stunned Ravenclaw from falling stone. The one who stayed with a dying aura so he did not leave the world alone. The one who kept repeating, he is back," until the Ministry could no longer pretend otherwise. Hufflepuff becomes the house of first responders and healers, of those who run toward the wounded rather than toward the headlines. Not Hagrid, who had always loved fiercely but moved on orders. Not Sirius, who had burned with reckless courage. It is the Badgers who are remembered as the first witnesses and the last to abandon their posts. Cedric's story becomes their myth. Not the tale of the loudest hero, but of the boy whose word weighed enough to tilt a government. Younger Hufflepuffs sit beneath the hourglass and whisper that their task is simple and terrible, to be the ones believed when it matters most. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow, but here, one grave in the Hufflepuff section of the cemetery reshapes how a house understands itself. And if Cedric Diggory's last breath could move a world, what else have we missed? Staring past the quiet figures at the edge of the frame? The next time you see a Hufflepuff in the background of this story, ask yourself whose truth they are already carrying and what will break when they finally speak. But to see what this alternate Cedric gives us, we have to look back at what his silence once cost. In the canon graveyard, there is no speech, no testimony, no shared narrative. There is a flash of green, a thud on cold earth, and a boy who never even understands that he has become a symbol. Cedric dies instantly. He does not cry out. He does not ask why. He does not send a Patronus or leave a coded message in the Priori Incantatem light. His death is so brutally simple that it almost resists interpretation, and that is precisely why it haunts. The grave was empty of explanation. There is only a body and a father screaming on the Hogwarts lawn. This is important, because his silence gives the wizarding world room to lie to itself. Without a witness, Cedric can be folded into a safer story. A tragic accident in a dangerous tournament, a miscast charm, an unfortunate collision of spells. Fudge can stand in the hospital wing and choose, quite calmly, to name it anything but murder. The Ministry can print memorial notices instead of warnings. The Daily Prophet can run photographs of Cedric as Quidditch captain while refusing to print the word Voldemort. His quiet death becomes a kind of political convenience. It allows people to walk past his grave and feel sorrow without consequence, to nod gravely and then return to their routines under the illusion that the world is still fundamentally intact. Not Dumbledore, who had seen too many bodies laid out on white sheets to believe in accidents anymore, but almost everyone else. For Harry, that silence is not neutral. It is a sentence. He returns from the graveyard with no corroborating voice, no echo except the one in his own nightmares. For a year, he is forced to carry the graveyard alone, replaying the moment Cedric fell while the adults around him debate his sanity. He watches Cedric's name become a weapon turned against him, proof, they say, that he is unstable, that he craves attention, that he is willing to exploit a dead boy's memory. There is a terrible purity in Cedric's canon fate. He does not choose to be a martyr or a herald. He is not given time to decide what kind of symbol he wishes to become. The magic that kills him is indifferent. The world that receives the news is evasive. The message is there, carved into the fact of a 17-year-old corpse, and yet the world simply fails to listen to what his death implies. So when we imagine a Cedric who speaks, who names Voldemort, who refuses to let his own dying be misfiled as an accident, we are not correcting the original story. We are holding up a lens. This alternate graveyard shows us what might have shifted if his last breath had carried truth into the open, and forces us to ask why. In the canon timeline, no one was willing to hear the truth that his silence already shouted. We pull the camera back now. The graveyard shrinks. The voices fade. What remains is a single divergence, a boy who does not die quickly enough. Cedric Diggory stays alive long enough to speak, to corroborate, to make Harry's horror a shared testimony instead of a solitary claim. This is important. That one breath, that one name forced past blood and shock, accelerates every major beat of the Second Wizarding War. In canon, denial buys Voldemort 2 quiet years. Here, that time is burned away in an instant. The ripples move outward. Hogwarts changes first. A Hufflepuff champion, admired by staff and students alike, does not return as a silent corpse, but as a witness whose last words are repeated in every corridor. Not Dumbledore, who had always believed Harry, but Sprout, McGonagall, Flitwick, even Snape must now teach under the weight of an acknowledged war. House politics harden and clarify, Slytherins forced to choose their masks earlier. Dastile resistance forming not in whispers but in organized, sanctioned defense lessons because the headmaster can no longer pretend this is temporary. The Ministry shifts next. Cornelius Fudge cannot dismiss boyish hysteria when the boy he is dismissing is dead and universally mourned. when grieving Hufflepuff parents stand in the atrium and demand to know why their son named Voldemort with his final breath. The Daily Prophet's smear campaign falters, fear still twists policy, but the lies are thinner, more brittle. Auras are recalled, Dementor deployments are questioned, and the Order of the Phoenix is not a shadow revival, but a contested half-public coalition that the Ministry tries and fails to fully control. Voldemort adapts. Deprived of secrecy, he abandons the slow infiltration that defined his canon return, and turns instead to terror that is immediate and theatrical, attacks on symbolic targets, graves desecrated, muggle and wizarding spaces struck in the same night to prove that nowhere is safe. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow in another story. Here, other graves are emptied by design. Their missing dead, a message that the past will not stay buried. In this rearranged war, different lives bend and break. Sirius is pulled into the light sooner, his innocence harder to deny when the Ministry cannot afford to waste a Black who hates Death Eaters more than he hates Azkaban. Dumbledore is forced to relinquish some control, to share fragments of prophecy and strategy with a public that will no longer accept paternal silence. Snape's double game tightens, with open hostilities reignited. Every lie he tells must be sharper, every occlumency barrier thicker, and the cost of a single misstep rises. Nothing is fixed. The magic does not become kinder because the truth surfaced faster. The burdens simply move. Harry carries less of the disbelief, but more of the visible expectation. Cedric's parents bear the weight of being the first sacrificial proof. Auras die in raids that would not have happened so soon. Children learn defensive spells in third year instead of fifth, and lose pieces of their childhood accordingly. Lily was a charms prodigy, and even in her most audacious plans, she could never have devised a charm that saves everyone. So the questions sharpen. What do we owe to those who warn us, when their warning demands that we abandon comfort for terror? How quickly should we act on truths that might be mistaken? And who dies when we hesitate versus when we rush headlong into battle? This is important, because every timeline answers differently. Here, the narrative portion of our journey closes. The map of this alternate war lies before you, accelerated, rearranged, no less tragic. What you do with it, what you forgive, and what you condemn is the part of the story only you can write. Now the map is drawn, you are no longer only watching. You are standing in it. The grave was empty in Godric's Hollow. The war accelerated, and Cedric Diggory did not vanish into a vague, convenient tragedy. He spoke. He named Voldemort. He corroborated Harry. This is important. So imagine yourself as you would have been, 11, 14, 17, wrapped in school robes that suddenly feel far too thin. You are in the Hufflepuff common room, or at the Ravenclaw table, or hunched over pumpkin juice in the Great Hall when the Whispers arrive. Cedric woke in the graveyard. Cedric saw the Dark Lord with his own eyes. Cedric begged them to believe Harry. You do not hear his voice. You hear it retold, distorted by fear and awe and house loyalty. What do you do with that second-hand truth? Do you slip quietly into the first Defense Association meeting, hands shaking as you sign your name beside people you barely know, deciding that if Cedric believed, you must learn to fight? Do you write home in a panic, ink blotted and uneven, demanding that your parents pull you from Hogwarts before the castle becomes a grave? Or do you cling, white-knuckled, to the Ministry's reassurances, telling yourself that Amos Diggory is grieving, that Harry is dramatic, that surely if Voldemort were truly alive, the adults would act? Shift the angle. You are no longer a child at a house table. You are a clerk in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, or a healer at St. Mungo's, or a functionary in the Department of International Magical Cooperation. You read the report, a Triwizard champion, beloved, level-headed, describes a resurrected dark wizard. Fudge calls for caution. Dumbledore calls for mobilization. Amos Diggory calls it murder and cover-up. Where do you stand when the first attacks begin, not in distant alleyways, but in places you know? With Fudge's insistence that more proof is needed, that panic is more dangerous than patience? Or with Amos's fury, the raw conviction that every day of delay is another name on a headstone? Not Dumbledore, who had seen wars before. Not Hagrid, who had always believed Harry. Not Sirius, who had lost everything once already. You, your desk, your quill, your choice. This is the quiet cruelty of denial. It rarely looks like villainy. It looks like waiting for one more report, one more body, one more incontrovertible charm result before you allow yourself to believe what you already knew in your bones. The magic of this alternate story is not only in Cedric's survival. It is in the way his testimony exposes a pattern that belongs to our world as much as his, the whistleblower unheard, the early warning dismissed, the uncomfortable truth postponed until it is no longer a warning but an epitaph. Cedric becomes more than a boy in a graveyard. He is a replica of every ignored alarm, every colleague who spoke too soon, every friend who said something was wrong long before the disaster arrived. When you feel the pull to doubt him, to wait, to demand a certainty that only catastrophe can provide, notice it. Use the space below this story as rehearsal. In your comments, answer as the student you might have been, or the ministry worker you might still become. Would you have joined the Da, or stayed with Fudge, or stood with Amos Diggory's grief? Practicing how to listen to uncomfortable possibilities here is its own small act of magic, and the next section will ask what kind of world that practice could build. So now the rehearsal is yours, but the next movement in this story depends on a different kind of choice. Not Harry's, not Dumbledore's. Yours. This is important. If Cedric Diggory had stood in that graveyard long enough to make the grave itself a witness, to prove that Harry was telling the truth while he was still alive, where does Order of the Phoenix fracture first for you? Is it in the very first chapter, with Fudge reading reports of cloaked figures instead of inventing Dementor attacks, or in Umbridge's first lesson, when a classroom full of children can quietly say, "We knew Cedric, and he would not have lied"? Name the single moment you think would warp the most, and tell us why. Do not answer with abstractions, answer with bodies, with names, with who you believe would live or die beneath this altered sky. Does Sirius make it past the veil because Harry is not isolated and half mad with disbelief? Does Dumbledore fall earlier because Voldemort is forced into open war instead of slow corrosion? Does Fred stand laughing at the end, or does Tonks? Or do you accept a world where one of them must still fall so that another rises? The grave was empty once in this universe, in your version, whose grave is spared, and whose becomes the necessary cost of Cedric's truth. Consider Fudge. Consider the small, stubborn man at the center of the Ministry's vast machinery. In this timeline, Does he break beneath the weight of two boys' matching testimony and admit the truth before the ministry shatters? Or does he cling harder, doubling down until the walls of his office are the last thing left standing around him? Describe the hearing you imagine, the headlines you see, the whispered conversations in corridors where everyone knew and no one would say it aloud. Lily was a charms prodigy, but this alternate war does not pivot on ancient magic alone. It turns on human decisions, a signature on a decree, a letter unsent, a hand not reached for on a staircase. Tell us the next fragile hinge you want this series to rest on. What if not Hagrid, who had carried Harry from the ruins, refused Dumbledore's orders just once? What if not Sirius, who had gone to the wrong street, paused long enough to doubt his own rage? Offer the small choices, the almosts, the replicas of courage and cowardice that could have remade everything. Your likes, your shares, and above all your careful, uncomfortable comments are not decorations, they are the map that tells us which dark corridors to walk down next. The plan for this series is written in pencil, waiting for your revisions. Speak your version of the war below, and in the next section we will follow one of those whispered paths to its end and discover who is still standing when the magic finally runs out. So we return to the grass, not the Hogwarts lawn, bright and loud with applause, but the cold, uneven earth of Little Hangleton, where the headstones lean like eavesdropping ghosts and the night itself seems to hold its breath. This is where our story split. This is where Cedric Diggory's body lay on the grave, where Harry's lungs burned, where one boy chose to spend the last clean breath he had on something other than comfort. He could have used it to say goodbye. He could have used it to ask Harry to tell his parents he loved them, to cling to some softer ending. Instead, in this version, he used it on the graveyard, on the Dark Lord, on the wand that had killed him and the circle of masked figures who had watched. On the truth. This is important, because the distance between canon and this darker branch of magic is not a grand prophecy or a secret charm. It is a single sentence forced through blood and terror. The grave was empty of certainty before he spoke. Not Dumbledore, who had always suspected the storm was coming. Not Fudge, who had wrapped himself in policy like a shield. Not Hagrid, who had carried Harry out of one ruined house and would have carried him from this graveyard if he could. None of them knew, in that exact moment, which story the world would choose to believe. We have followed the consequences of that breath through courtrooms and classrooms, through hastily rewritten ministry decrees and late-night meetings in the headmaster's office. We have watched as Cedric's name, carved in stone on a Hufflepuff banner and whispered in the corridors, forced adults to look harder, to listen longer, to hesitate before dismissing a boy's account as hysteria. A single choice to speak became the hinge on which battles, alliances, and funerals turned. And now, as the echoes fade, the graveyard waits again. Two boys, one living, one dying, both of them pressed against the same invisible threshold where a story can still be bent. Harry, shaking, wand clenched in his hand. Cedric, fingers already cooling, eyes fixed on a sky he will not see again. Between them, not just a wand of holly and phoenix feather, but the wand of narrative itself, the thin channel through which the future is pronounced. You have walked with them through a version of events that does not flinch, that allows the war to be more complicated, more compromised, less merciful than the tale you first learned. Sitting with that is its own kind of courage. to admit that heroes can be believed too late, that justice can arrive in the wrong order, that even when someone is right, the grave may still claim them. So the question leaves the graveyard and comes to you. When you see something terrible coming, when the air tightens and you know the next breath matters, will you spend it on reassurance, or will you spend it on truth? Which story will you lend your voice to when it would be easier to stay silent? The grave was empty of guarantees in every universe, but someone always speaks first. Someone is always the Cedric of their own small war, choosing to name what they have seen even as the world looks away. In one world, it is a boy in a graveyard. In another, it is you, in a room that suddenly feels too quiet. Carry that image with you. Two figures in the dark, one rising, one falling, both bound by the same thin line of belief. Remember that magic begins where someone decides to trust a story before it is safe. And if you are still listening, still turning this over in your mind, then the wand of narrative has passed to your hand. Use it. Speak. Decide who you will believe first and what you will dare to say while you are still alive enough to say it.